Hey guys, tonight we're diving fork first into the candlelit dining rooms and smoky alleyway kitchens of ancient Rome, but not quite the way your history teacher framed it. Imagine the clamor of the Forum fading behind you, the air thick with roasted garlic, incense, and the not-so-faint scent of donkey manure. You duck beneath a tapestry into a cramped apartment where flickering lamplight dances over low tables, but instead of a toga-clad senator sipping wine between oyster courses, you see a few tired figures breaking flat loaves of bread in silence, murmuring strange words about a man who died and came back to life. This isn't just dinner. This is the birth of something radically new. You probably won't survive this. You're a Roman citizen, and suddenly your table manners might get you arrested or worse, thrown to the lions, because the people you're eating with tonight, they're Christians, and they're about to flip Roman cuisine on its well-oiled head. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is for you down in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the narrow courtyard where a group of early Christians have gathered, away from the wine-soaked aristocrats and the ritual blood offerings. In your hands, a simple loaf course, dense, probably filled with sand from the local millstone. But to them, it's sacred. You break it. They nod solemnly, and you feel it. Bread is no longer just a carbohydrate. It's theology. The shift begins quietly. In the early 1st century, Christian communities are still largely Jewish, clinging to dietary traditions that emphasize unleavened bread during Passover. So when Jesus holds up bread during the Last Supper and says, "This is my body," it echoes older rituals, but then it pivots into radical new meaning. It's not just memory now, it's presence. That loaf you're munching, it's not just symbolizing Jesus. For many, it is Jesus. That belief, you realize, creates ripples far beyond dinner. Suddenly, not all bread is equal. Do you use leavened or unleavened? What if it's baked by someone who sacrifices to Jupiter on the weekends? Is it still holy if it's stale? Historians still argue whether early Christians consistently saw the Eucharist as literal or metaphorical. Some sources suggest symbolic remembrance. Others hint at a mystical transformation right there on the tongue. Either way, the bread isn't just food anymore. It's sacrament, boundary, even identity. And identity gets tricky in a multicultural empire. Roman society runs on showy food. Lavish dinners are how the rich prove their importance. You'd rather not defer your carbs. Christians, often poor and cautious, begin redefining what it means to eat well, not by quality or excess, but by humility and shared purpose. In fact, you might find yourself at a conversatio, a secret meal where everyone contributes a little something. The bread passed around might be stale or even molded with herbs for preservation, but it's not the flavor that matters, it's the shared act, the memory of that one Last Supper that launched a whole new worldview. Mainstream Romans find this baffling. Bread as divine. That's like worshipping the lunch menu. Rumors start to swirl. Christians eat babies. They drink blood. You try not to laugh as you nibble your crust and overhear a market woman whisper that your people are cannibals. The symbolic language of body and blood doesn't exactly help, and yet you persist, because the bread does something strange. It equalizes. In a world obsessed with class and hierarchy, this meal levels everyone. Freedmen and nobles alike take the same bite. Even slaves get to eat first. Sometimes, that's not just rebellious, that's revolutionary. One fringe story you hear about is a Christian baker in Gaul who starts baking tiny fish symbols into the loaves. They're not obvious, just a little curve, a line or two, enough to say this bread is safe. This bread is ours. It's the ancient version of slapping a sticker on your lunchbox that says, "I'm with the weirdos," and you are, over time. As Christian influence grows, so does the importance of who bakes the bread and how. By the late 2nd century, communities begin setting rules. Eucharistic bread must be made with clean water, by baptized hands, without any trace of pagan blessing. That's a big ask in a city where most mills double as temples to obscure grain gods. One day, you stumble into a debate that sounds eerily modern. Some Christians want artisanal, hand-kneaded, spiritually pure loaves. Others say, it's just bread, stop overthinking it. A proto-hipster near the Tiber insists on using only emmer wheat, because that's what Jesus probably ate. You roll your eyes, but the arguments run deeper. The type of bread can become a theological minefield. The East leans toward leavened, symbolizing resurrection. The West prefers unleavened, recalling Passover. You don't know it yet, but this yeast debate will one day help split the entire church. For now, you just sit in the dim glow, chewing quietly as the bread passes from hand to hand. There's no tablecloth, no silver cutlery, just a silence that fills the room like smoke. No one speaks much, but everyone understands. You think about how bread, this poor man's food, has elbowed its way into divine territory. The same flour, water, and fire that fueled armies and slaves now feeds saints and sinners. In Christianity's hands, bread becomes a story, a sermon, a stand against decadence. Even as Rome keeps stuffing its mouth with dormice and peacock tongues, you choose the crust, you choose the crumb, because here, in this tiny borrowed room, the bread doesn't just fill your stomach, it defines your soul. You blink against the flickering candlelight, and your senses shift as the aroma of wine fills the air. There's something about the liquid gold of ancient wine. It isn't just a drink, it's an experience. A privilege, a badge of status. In the grand feasts of Rome, wine flows like rivers, spiced and diluted to soften the edges of revelry. But as you settle deeper into the world of early Christians, you notice a stark contrast. Wine isn't just for drinking anymore, it's for salvation. At a Roman banquet, you'd be expected to down your goblet of wine, like a gladiator charging into battle. You'd likely wash down a rich stew or a roasted boar with it, cracking jokes and discussing politics while you slowly drift into a bacchanalian stupor. Wine, after all, was a gift from Bacchus, the Roman god of revelry and excess. It was part of the ritual, a part of the scene, a symbol of both festivity and indulgence. In these lavish affairs, wine was a status symbol, a way to show your wealth, your power, your ability to live life in the fast lane. But here, with the Christians, you get a different feeling, a quiet reverence. In their dimly lit meeting halls, wine is no longer the fluid of indulgence. It's no longer about how much you can drink or how many cups you can down. Instead, it's about meaning and about a man who turned the world upside down. In the Christian tradition, the transformation of wine is profound. No longer a drink for indulgence or revelry, Wine becomes the blood of Christ. During the Last Supper, Jesus takes a cup of wine, blesses it, and tells his followers that this wine is his blood, shed for the forgiveness of sins. Suddenly, this simple drink, which once symbolized excess, becomes an embodiment of sacrifice. You feel it as you watch the Christians sip their wine slowly, intentionally, with a deep awareness of its significance. It's not just to wash down bread anymore. It's to carry the memory of that final meal. And it's a memory that extends into something beyond mere dinner. It's a link between heaven and earth, between the divine and the mortal. The wine you sip in this secret gathering isn't about getting drunk or losing yourself. It's about remembering, connecting, and honoring. Historians still argue whether this transformation of wine into a symbol of Christ's blood was immediate or gradual. Some scholars believe early Christians had to navigate a complex set of practices, trying to balance their new faith with the pervasive Roman culture of indulgence. Others suggest the change in attitude was more instantaneous, almost like a flash of understanding that shifted wine from a tool of Bacchus to a tool of salvation. The theological implications run deep. If wine is sacred, then everything about its consumption changes. Wine no longer has the same carefree, exuberant quality that you'd find at a lavish Roman feast. Instead, its consumption is tied to humility, to sacrificial love, to the redemptive act of Christ's death. It's no longer just about pleasure, it's about purpose. But there's a problem. Roman society loves its wine, loves it in excess. The streets echo with the clinking of wine cups. The marketplace vibrates with talk of the finest vintages, and banquets overflow with generous pours. Wine is a symbol of luxury and status, a way to mark one's place at the top of the social ladder. The early Christians find themselves caught in a difficult position. How do you embrace this sacred tradition of wine without falling into the same excesses that have come to define Roman social life? It's here that the church's relationship with food and with wine begins to develop a more restrained, ascetic quality. Christians don't just reject excess, they begin to reshape the very idea of what it means to dine. Where Roman feasts are about flaunting wealth and excess, Christian meals are about community, humility, and purpose. One particularly interesting tidbit about Christian wine consumption is the practice of mixing it with water. While Romans tended to drink their wine straight, mixing it with water was a distinctly Christian innovation, likely meant to both temper the wine's potency and to reflect the humble nature of Christ's sacrifice. It was a subtle but significant shift, a way to temper the old traditions of indulgence with the new values of restraint and reverence. But even in the midst of these shifts, the Christians are still part of the Roman world, and you can't escape the influence of Roman society entirely. For many, the wine they drink might come from the same vineyards that supply the lavish banquets of the elite. And the act of turning wine into the blood of Christ doesn't erase the fact that it's a beverage steeped in centuries of association with revelry and luxury. By the 2nd century, Christian communities start to establish distinct rules and rituals around the consumption of wine. You won't find it served casually anymore. Wine isn't part of the marketplace banter. It's sacred. For some, this means limiting its use to the Eucharist, the most important sacrament in Christianity. Others, however, still partake in wine outside of the ritual context, but with more mindfulness and caution, recognizing its power to symbolize Christ's blood and the gravity of his sacrifice. The shift in wine consumption isn't just about the liquid itself, though it's about the community it creates. early Christians begin to gather around the Eucharistic meal, their wine shared equally among the rich, the poor, the slaves, and the free. This act, this shared cup, becomes a symbol of unity, a way to erase social divisions and embrace equality under Christ. In time, these Christian practices of wine consumption spread throughout the empire, but, despite their best efforts, some of the old Roman habits remain. By the 4th century, under Emperor Constantine, Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. And while the Eucharist becomes a central part of public life, wine's long association with Roman revelry is far from forgotten. Yet, in the Christian world, wine is no longer just wine. It's a symbol, a memory, and a promise. You start to realize that, for the Christians, wine is less about getting drunk and more about what it represents: the blood of Christ that was shed for the salvation of all. You reflect on the journey of wine from Bacchus to Christ. A drink that once symbolized indulgence now symbolizes sacrifice and unity. It's a reminder of how food, even something as simple as wine, can carry layers of meaning and transform an entire society. As the cup is passed around the room, you take a sip, not just of wine, but of history, of faith, and of the radical redefinition of what it means to break bread and share a drink in a world that's slowly being turned upside down by Christianity. The air smells different now, thick, with the scent of boiling fish and the faint aroma of vinegar. If you were in a Roman home, you'd likely find a kitchen buzzing with activity. A pot of garum, that deliciously foul fermented fish sauce, simmering on the stove, ready to be drizzled over everything from vegetables to meat. Roman cuisine thrives on complexity, layers of flavor, and an extravagant reliance on sauces. But as you sit quietly among this small group of Christians, you realize something. Their relationship with food isn't about indulgence or excess. It's about simplicity, austerity, and shared sustenance. You are about to witness yet another shift, this time in how meat and fish are viewed. In the grand halls of the wealthy Roman elite, meat is the symbol of affluence, power, and luxury. Fattened pigs, plump geese, even dormice roasted with honey. All these delicacies are part of the Roman feast. The more exotic, the more lavish, the better. It's about showing off. You'll find oysters, imported spices from the East, and even wild game like boar or deer in these grand settings. The kitchen becomes a stage for opulence, where the finest chefs cater to the tastes of the rich and powerful. When a Roman nobleman hosts a banquet, it's a performance. The food is decadent, the wine flows freely, and the guests indulge without restraint. It's an almost theatrical experience, where excess is the star of the show. Now, imagine the contrast. You're sitting in a humble gathering, and there's no garum here, no fatty meats, no exotic spices. Instead, the table is simple bread, wine, a few herbs, and some fish. You may even spot a small fish on the table, but it's not the star of the meal. It's humble, it's practical, and that's the first thing you notice. Christians, especially the early ones, begin redefining their relationship with food, in stark contrast to the extravagant Roman feasts. There's a reason behind this shift. Christians are trying to distance themselves from the decadence of the Roman elite. The very nature of Christianity calls for humility and asceticism. This is a movement against the consumerism that Roman dining celebrates. Instead of indulging in luxurious feasts, early Christians focus on living simply, and eating to sustain life, not to celebrate wealth or status. Historians still debate whether this shift was entirely theological or whether it was a matter of practicality. Early Christians were often poor, and it's clear that the lack of wealth influenced their food choices. Theologians, however, argue that the rejection of luxury was a conscious attempt to embody Christ's teachings of humility. Jesus himself was often depicted as eating simple meals, bread and fish, embodying the ideals of asceticism. This rejection of excess wasn't just a practical choice, but also a theological one to follow. Christ meant to embrace simplicity. In these early Christian communities, fish plays a significant role, not just as food, but as a symbol. The Christian fish symbol, or ichthys, is born out of a time when Christians were still trying to fly under the radar of Roman persecution. The fish represents Jesus, the Son of God, the Savior, but it's also a subtle nod to the humble nature of early Christianity. Fish, unlike meat, isn't laden with status. It's a modest, everyday food, and its association with Jesus makes it even more significant. The Christians around you are eating fish in a completely different way. For them, it's not just sustenance, it's a symbol of their faith. But here's the catch. Roman dining didn't just involve meat and fish, it also involved a great deal of vegetarian cuisine. Romans ate an array of vegetables, including beans, leeks, and olives, all dressed with garum and oil. But here, in the Christian circle, even the vegetables are more modest. There are no decadent herbs, no lavish oils, just simple, humble produce, often shared among the group in an atmosphere of unity rather than luxury. As Christianity spreads, this practice of simplifying the diet and embracing vegetarianism becomes more widespread. By the 3rd century, many Christians are voluntarily abstaining from meat on certain days of the week, particularly Wednesdays and Fridays, as a way to practice self-discipline and penance. This asceticism is not just a rejection of Roman excess, it's a way to embody Christ's suffering, to be reminded of the sacrifice he made on the cross. By fasting and abstaining from luxurious foods, Christians are meant to unite in a common experience, focused on spirituality rather than indulgence. One quirky fact you learn during your travels is that early Christians in the Roman Empire often turned their fasts into social occasions. You might find them gathering for a love feast, a communal meal where everyone shares what little they have. Often during times of fasting, no sumptuous spread here, just simple loaves of bread, a little olive oil, and maybe a few grapes. These feasts weren't about indulgence, they were about unity, community, and solidarity in a world that was often hostile to their beliefs. Now, let's not sugarcoat it entirely. Roman cuisine, for all its excess, also had a darker side. Many of the extravagant feasts that you witnessed were tied to religious rituals. And there's one thing that the early Christians made very clear: they would not be part of these pagan celebrations. Sacrifices to the gods, often involving the killing of animals and the subsequent feasting on their flesh, were common in Roman religious ceremonies. To early Christians, participating in such rituals would be tantamount to idolatry. Eating meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods was strictly forbidden. As Christianity spreads and becomes more institutionalized, this separation from pagan food practices becomes more formalized, and Christian communities start setting strict dietary rules to differentiate themselves from Roman religious and cultural practices. By the time Christianity becomes the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, Meat consumption is already subject to Christian guidelines. Meat, particularly meat that had been sacrificed to idols, is no longer acceptable. The Church formally discourages lavish feasts, and fasting becomes a regular part of the Christian lifestyle. Even the Roman habit of frequenting public baths to indulge in food and drink is avoided, as it was seen as a place of excess and immoral behavior. You pause for a moment, reflecting on this transformation from the luxurious, almost mythic meals of the Roman elite to the humble simplicity of Christian tables. Food becomes a marker of identity. No longer is it just about filling the stomach, it's about filling the soul. In a society obsessed with consumption, Christians find a new way to approach food with reverence, with humility, and with a deeper sense of community. It's a quiet revolution, but it's one that will resonate through history, influencing not just what Christians eat, but how they relate to one another and the world around them. You can almost hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth as you settle into the rhythm of another Christian meal. The day's heat has subsided, and as the shadows lengthen in the narrow room, you are reminded again of the radical transformation happening in food culture. There is no extravagant feast laid out before you. No gilded plates or intricate dishes filled with exotic fruits or lavish meats. Instead, you see a few modest bowls of vegetables, a loaf of bread, and a small bowl of olives. But the meal, though simple, feels weighty. This is a meal of purpose, a meal that reflects an entirely new ethos. And in many ways, it is at the heart of Christianity's long-term impact on Roman food culture. One of the most significant changes brought on by the spread of Christianity is the shift away from luxury and excess in the kitchen. Roman banquets, with their multi-course extravaganzas, had been designed to showcase wealth and power. The rich would indulge in all the finest meats, exotic spices, and rare delicacies that the empire had to offer. But now, in this Christian gathering, the foods are humble. There's no emphasis on opulence or indulgence. The focus has shifted to sharing and sustaining life, rather than indulging in it. But what strikes you most is the symbolism that runs through every bite. The Christian meal isn't just about food, it's about spiritual nourishment. And it's here that we begin to understand the crucial role that fasting plays in shaping Christian food culture. Roman society had its fair share of fasting practices, often linked to religious rituals. However, for the Christians, fasting became a deeply personal and communal practice, a way to align themselves with Christ's own sacrifice. The early Christian tradition of fasting became a cornerstone of their faith and a way to demonstrate their devotion. It wasn't about dieting or controlling appetites. It was about drawing closer to God. You've probably heard that fasting is a centuries-old tradition in many religious and spiritual practices. But for Christians, it takes on unique significance. Early Christians, especially those in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, began to observe fasting as a way of embodying Christ's own 40-day fast in the desert. This meant abstaining from food, not to punish the body, but to purify the soul. It wasn't about self-denial for the sake of asceticism. It was about making room for the divine presence. Historians still debate the exact timing and rules of early Christian fasting. Some argue that it started as a private, voluntary practice, a personal sacrifice for each believer. Others suggest that by the 3rd century, fasting became more formalized, especially on specific days of the week, like Wednesdays and Fridays. These days were chosen in remembrance of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion, a way to link the act of fasting to the central events of Christian belief. But fasting didn't just mean abstaining from all food. Early Christian fasting involved specific rules about what was eaten. Typically, it meant refraining from meat and sometimes from dairy products. Roman Christians, especially those living in cities like Rome and Antioch, it began to avoid rich, indulgent foods like meat, eggs, and cheese, which had been staples in Roman feasts. Instead, they ate more simple, plant-based meals, lentils, beans, and fruits. You could say it was a diet of simplicity and reverence, a way to cultivate humility and spiritual focus. You observe how the communal nature of these meals further reinforces Christian values. Food, in this setting, isn't about satisfying individual desires. It's about coming together as a community. The early Christians developed a tradition of communal meals known as the agape, or love feast. These meals were shared by all members of the community, regardless of social status or wealth. The meals were simple, but the significance was profound. It wasn't about what was on the table, it was about the bond between believers. In many ways, this was a radical break from Roman dining practices, where social status was often emphasized in the way food was prepared and consumed. The Christian focus on communal eating, particularly during the agape feasts, reflects a deep theological commitment to equality. Roman meals, particularly those hosted by the wealthy elite, often reinforced social hierarchies. The guests at these banquets were stratified by their wealth, social class, and political power. The more lavish the banquet, the more pronounced these distinctions became. But in the Christian meal, the distinctions evaporated. There was no longer a hierarchy at the table. Everyone was welcome, whether rich or poor, free or slave. This was not just a culinary shift, it was a radical social statement. By the 4th century, when Constantine legalized Christianity and the faith began to spread more widely across the empire, this emphasis on communal meals would become a central part of Christian identity. The Eucharist, which was already a cornerstone of Christian worship, would become a symbolic center of Christian food culture. The act of sharing bread and wine in remembrance of Christ's body and blood would not only connect believers spiritually, but also reinforce the idea of equality and unity within the Christian community. Interestingly, these communal meals and the emphasis on fasting had a long-lasting impact on Roman dining habits. As Christianity spread, the influence of asceticism and the rejection of indulgent feasts began to permeate even Roman society. By the time the Roman Empire transitioned into the Byzantine Empire, feasting was no longer the lavish, excessive ritual it had once been. The Church, through its teachings and practices, reshaped the culture of dining in profound ways. And yet, even as Christianity began to reshape the food culture of the empire, remnants of Roman dining habits lingered. The rich continued to host banquets, though the nature of the meals began to change. Meat was still a prized commodity, but the decadence of earlier feasts was replaced by a more controlled and regulated approach. The early Christians had taught the world that indulgence was not the way to true nourishment both of the body and the soul, but the desire for fine food, the rich flavors, and the complex recipes remained. In fact, over time, Christian monasteries would become centers of culinary innovation. Monks would begin to develop new ways of preparing food that adhered to the principles of simplicity and restraint, but also honored the communal aspect of eating. They would cultivate their own gardens, grow their own grains, and bake bread in their abbeys. The meals prepared in these settings were simple, but rich in symbolism, reinforcing the spiritual principles of humility and reverence. One quirky tidbit that fascinates you is how certain early Christian feasts, like Easter and Christmas, began to incorporate foods that were symbolic of Christ's life and sacrifice. For example, the tradition of eating fish on Fridays and during Lent, which originally began as a form of abstinence, it would later become a way to honor Christ, who had been associated with fish. The Christian fish symbol, already prominent in the 2nd century, now became part of the regular diet. As you look around the room, you notice that, despite the simplicity of the meal, it's filled with deep meaning. Each dish, whether a loaf of bread, a bowl of olives, or a plate of fish, carries the weight of centuries of tradition. It's no longer just about food. It's about how food connects you to something greater than yourself, to a community that transcends time and space. You realize now that this modest meal is part of a much larger narrative, one where food, once a symbol of indulgence, has become a symbol of unity, humility, and spirituality. The transformation of Roman food culture by Christianity is a quiet revolution that reshapes how society views nourishment, both physical and spiritual. The evening grows quieter as the firelight flickers and the last morsels of bread are dipped into the final sip of wine. The air in the room, once filled with the bustle of conversation, now feels contemplative, almost sacred. You're beginning to understand that every part of this meal, every simple dish, carries not just nourishment but a deeper meaning. It's more than survival, it's a form of communion. The food around you, humble and unpretentious, feels like a part of something larger, something eternal. But before you can settle into the profound serenity of the moment, you realize that this is just one of many ways that early Christianity reshapes food culture across the empire. Food, after all, isn't just something we consume, it's something we use to express our beliefs, our priorities, and our worldview. Let's take a step back and look at another important influence that Christianity had on Roman food practices, the way in which the calendar itself began to influence what people ate. In a world where feasts were dictated by the changing seasons and the religious holidays of the empire, Christianity introduced a new rhythm to life, one that was tied not just to the harvest or the gods of Rome, but to the life and teachings of Christ. When you think of a Roman feast, it's easy to imagine extravagant banquets during public festivals. These festivals were held in honor of Roman gods Jupiter, Bacchus, and others whose favor was sought through sacrifices and lavish meals. The Romans were masters of tying food to religious observance, and festivals were an integral part of their calendar. These feasts involved an overabundance of food, from delicacies like roasted pig and Mulsum wine, mixed with honey, to fruits, nuts, and fish, all lavishly prepared and presented. But with the rise of Christianity, this cyclical relationship with food tied to Roman festivals began to shift. Christian holidays, like Easter, Christmas, and Lent began to play a central role in the Christian calendar, completely altering the rhythm of eating. These holidays, based on the life and death of Christ, led to new fasting practices, new feasts, and even new forms of communal dining. The first major transformation happened with the establishment of Lent, a period of 40 days leading up to Easter, during which Christians were called to fast in remembrance of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. During Lent, meat was often avoided, and foods that were seen as luxuries, such as dairy products and eggs, were also prohibited Instead, Christians focused on plant-based meals, grains, legumes, and vegetables which were simple, affordable, and aligned with the Christian call for humility and penance. But as Lent evolved into a more widespread practice, it also began to shape the food culture of the empire. You notice the strange paradox. On one hand, Christianity encourages simplicity and fasting, and on the other, it creates the need for special meals to mark the end of the fast. Enter Easter. After 40 days of restraint, Christians would come together to celebrate the resurrection of Christ with a feast, one that was centered on meat, eggs, and dairy, foods that had been forbidden during Lent. This wasn't just a celebration of Christ's resurrection, it was a celebration of abundance after a period of sacrifice. By the 4th century, Christianity's influence on food calendars had spread across the empire. The Church officially recognized fasting periods, and communal feasts were encouraged during key moments of the Christian liturgical year. Christmas, too, became a time for feasting, but unlike the Roman festivals, which were deeply tied to pagan gods and the cycles of nature, Christian feasts like Easter and Christmas were focused on spiritual renewal and salvation. This shift in how the calendar influenced food habits also reflects a broader change in how the Christian community viewed its relationship with the material world. In the Roman Empire, food was often tied to the gods and the supernatural. Offerings of food, particularly meat, were presented to gods in the hopes of securing divine favor. But as Christianity took hold, the emphasis shifted from appeasing gods to honoring Christ's sacrifice and the gift of eternal life. The act of fasting or feasting was no longer about securing favor from the divine. It was about participating in a shared remembrance of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Interestingly, as Christianity spread, it also influenced how the Roman world approached the act of communal dining. Gone were the large banquets held in honor of the gods. In their place came the communal Christian meal, a shared, often humble gathering that emphasized equality, charity, and love. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of Christianity, was seen as the ultimate form of communal dining. Christians would gather to share bread and wine, not just as sustenance, but as a powerful reminder of Christ's body and blood. These meals, small and intimate, became a focal point of Christian identity. In a world where social divisions ran deep, where class distinctions were firmly entrenched in the feasts of the wealthy and the banquets of the emperors, Christianity's emphasis on equality and charity changed the way people saw each other at the table. No longer was food a commodity reserved for the rich. No longer was the feast a place to flaunt wealth and power. Now, the meal was a place where all believers, regardless of their social status, could come together in a shared act of remembrance. And as you sit at the table with your fellow Christians, sharing a simple meal of bread and olives, you begin to understand the deeper social implications of these changes. The early Christians were not just revolutionizing what people ate, they were revolutionizing who ate together and how. Food was no longer a marker of class or status, it was a tool for unity, a way to create a community that transcended worldly divisions. The table, in the Christian tradition, became a place of fellowship, where all were equal, all were welcome, and all could share in the divine nourishment that came not from wealth or power, but from love and sacrifice. As Christianity grew and spread throughout the Roman Empire, this transformation would continue. The communal Christian meal, centered around the Eucharist, became the foundation for the Christian approach to food and dining. whether at a grand feast or a humble table. The Christian meal was a reflection of Christ's love and the unity of believers. In the end, it was a meal that not only nourished the body, but also the soul. The night deepens, and you're sitting around a modest table. The bread is simple. The wine unadorned. Everything here seems far removed from the opulent banquets of Roman society. The more you observe, the more you sense that food, for early Christians, wasn't about luxury, but about deeper meaning, simplicity, and community. The meal you're sharing here is an expression of faith, a small but profound shift in Roman dining habits. Christianity, at its core, promotes humility, and that's reflected in how food is approached. No longer are feasts about indulgence or showcasing wealth. Instead, food becomes an instrument of spiritual practice, connecting people to Christ's life, death, and resurrection. The Roman calendar, once filled with extravagant religious feasts honoring pagan gods, now shifts. Christianity introduces its own calendar of fasting and feasting, with the focus shifting from appeasing deities to commemorating the life of Christ. Lent, for example, marks a period of fasting, where Christians refrain from eating rich foods like meat, eggs, and dairy. This practice ties into the 40 days that Jesus spent fasting in the desert. But after this period of restraint, Easter arrives, bringing a celebration of Christ's resurrection and the return of meat and dairy to the table. It's a feast born out of sacrifice, an expression of gratitude after a season of penance. These new Christian practices reshape food culture throughout the empire. Where Roman feasts were once defined by indulgence, Christian meals become about unity and humility. The focus on communal meals, especially during key holidays like Easter and Christmas, emphasizes shared spiritual nourishment over worldly excess. Christian meals are not just about feeding the body, they're about fostering fellowship. They become places of equality, where the wealthy and the poor can sit side by side, all united in remembrance of Christ. The transformation of food from luxury to simple sustenance has lasting implications, reshaping not just what people eat, but how they view one another and their relationship with God. The fire flickers, casting dancing shadows across the room. You sit quietly, reflecting on how a simple meal, bread, wine, olives can carry so much weight, so much meaning. What's particularly striking is how the Christian meal has woven itself into the very fabric of daily life. The celebration of faith through food has permeated not just the grand occasions, but also the small, daily rituals. It's a shift that doesn't just affect what is on the plate, but how it's shared, how it shapes the community, and how it embodies the very essence of Christian belief. When you think about Roman feasts, it's hard to ignore the extravagant displays of wealth. These were not just meals, they were social events, meant to impress, to entertain, and to showcase status. Wealthy Romans would invite guests to lavish banquets with multiple courses, rich meats, and exotic delicacies. Food was a tool of social positioning, marking out the elite from the common people. It wasn't uncommon to see an entire roasted boar, imported delicacies like garum, fermented fish sauce, and extravagant dessert on Roman banquetables. But with the rise of Christianity, the message shifts. The goal is no longer to impress or to indulge, it's to nourish, both physically and spiritually. Christianity's influence on Roman dining practices grows stronger as the centuries pass. You notice that as the early church gains power and influence, the traditional Roman banquet begins to lose its grip. The shift is subtle at first, but it's clear that food no longer holds the same significance. The indulgent feasts of old become less important than the act of communal sharing. The church begins to shape food practices by incorporating the themes of humility, charity, and sacrifice that are central to Christian teachings. Fasting becomes an important part of this shift. While Romans had fasted for various reasons, it was often linked to religious rituals intended to gain favor with the gods. For Christians, however, fasting takes on a new meaning. It's not about appeasing deities, it's about spiritual growth. The act of fasting becomes an expression of devotion, a way to emulate Christ's own sacrifice. Christians would fast in preparation for major feast days, like Easter and Christmas. These fasts were seen as a way to purify the body and soul, preparing the faithful for the great feast that would follow. But fasting wasn't just a matter of abstinence. It was also about the way food was prepared. Meat, eggs, and dairy, once staples in Roman banquets, were now avoided. Instead, meals consisted of vegetables, grains, and legumes. These foods were simple and nourishing, often prepared in humble ways. The Christian diet during fasting periods reflected the larger theological emphasis on self-denial and spiritual focus. One of the more interesting shifts was the rise of fish as a prominent food during fasting periods. Historically, fish had been a symbol of Christ, considered a humble, simple food that could be eaten even during the strictest fasts. By the 4th century, fish had become the go-to food for Christians on Fridays, a tradition that persists even today in many parts of the world. It's fascinating how a food that once symbolized abundance now became a sign of simplicity, reinforcing the church's message of spiritual devotion over material indulgence. By now, you're realizing that the humble meal you share isn't just an isolated event. It's part of a much larger cultural and theological transformation. Christianity has shifted the very foundation of Roman dining, and it's done so through subtle but powerful changes. The communal meal, once a symbol of social hierarchy and excess, has become an expression of equality and unity. Everyone, whether rich or poor, shares in the same food, reflecting the Christian teaching that all are equal in the eyes of God. As Christianity spreads, the impact on Roman food culture deepens. The focus on communal meals and fasting isn't just about personal piety, it's about creating a new social order. The wealthy no longer dominate the dinner table. Everyone is welcome to share in the feast. These meals become a place of fellowship, a time to remember Christ's sacrifice, and a reminder that true wealth isn't in food, but in community. This shift also begins to affect the wider culture of hospitality in the empire. In Roman society, hospitality was often tied to one's social status. Elaborate banquets were invitations to flaunt wealth and power. But in the Christian tradition, hospitality becomes more about service and equality. The Christian idea of charity leads to a broader redefinition of what it means to host a meal. Meals are no longer just about entertainment, they are about serving others, sharing with those in need, and reflecting Christ's love through actions. Hospitality becomes a form of ministry, a tangible way to express faith through food. This isn't to say that food wasn't still important in Christian society. Quite the opposite. In fact, Christianity's transformation of Roman food culture didn't mean that food became any less meaningful. On the contrary, it became a deeply spiritual practice. The Eucharist, Christ's body and blood, in the form of bread and wine, became the central act of Christian worship, a meal that transcended mere sustenance to embody the core of the Christian faith. Sharing in the Eucharist wasn't just about eating, it was about becoming one with Christ and with the community of believers. In this way, Christianity didn't just change the way people ate, it changed the very purpose of food. Food was no longer merely a means of survival, or a way to indulge one's desires. It became a way to connect with the divine, a means of nourishing not just the body, but the soul. Food became sacred. The communal Christian meal, centered around the Eucharist, became the cornerstone of Christian life and worship. As you sit back, reflecting on this transformation, you realize that what seemed like a simple shift in diet is actually part of a much deeper revolution in how society views food, hospitality, and the sacred. Christianity took the act of eating and elevated it, turning the mundane into something profoundly spiritual. Every meal, whether humble or grand, became an opportunity for communion both with God and with one another. The flickering shadows of the room grow longer as the night stretches on, but there's still something calming about the simplicity of the meal. Bread and water, this ancient combination seems like a humble offering, but it now feels like a deeper, sacred act. As you chew thoughtfully, you're reminded that the act of eating is never just about the food. It's about what the food represents. And tonight, you're witnessing how Christianity took food beyond simple sustenance, transforming it into something sacred and deeply reflective of its core values. As Christianity spreads throughout the Roman Empire, this profound shift in food culture doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it evolves slowly, as more and more Christians come to understand that food isn't merely about indulgence, but about reflection, humility, and unity. It's not surprising that one of the key elements that undergoes a transformation is the way Christians approach hospitality, the very act of inviting others into their homes to share food and fellowship. Roman society, as you know, was defined by rigid social hierarchies. Banquets and meals were often public spectacles, intended to display wealth and status. To host a grand feast was to show one's power and importance, and the food served at these meals reflected that status. Exotic spices, rich meats, and delicate desserts were the trademarks of an elite banquet. But the Christian approach to hospitality is drastically different. The Christian meal isn't about who has the most wealth or the most extravagant food. It's about serving others. Early Christians were encouraged to provide meals for the poor, to share their resources, and to invite those who had little into their homes. This wasn't just about being kind. It was a reflection of Christ's teachings on love, humility, and charity. When you host a meal in the Christian tradition, the goal is to emulate the servant leader model of Christ. You're not looking to impress your guests. You're looking to serve them, to show love in the simplest and most profound ways possible. Think about it. Christ himself, in the Gospels, was constantly associating with the marginalized. He dined with tax collectors, sinners, and the outcasts of society. Early Christians took this as a model for their own meals. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christian communities were known for their charity and hospitality. They would invite strangers and the poor to their tables, often sharing what little they had. A Christian meal, at its core, became an opportunity to serve and to reflect Christ's love and hospitality to all. There's something radically countercultural about this. In Roman society, your position in the social hierarchy determined what you ate and with whom you dined. But in the Christian tradition, food becomes a tool for dismantling social distinctions. A rich man and a poor man could sit side by side at the same table, sharing the same bread and wine. This doesn't just reflect an egalitarian attitude, it's a direct challenge to the prevailing Roman worldview that tied food to status. The Christian meal, while humble in its nature, comes with a kind of quiet revolution. It's an act that rejects the ostentatious feasts of the elite, where the poor were excluded or ignored. Instead, it centers on mutual respect, equality, and love. The table becomes a place of fellowship, where all are invited to share in the abundance of God's grace, regardless of their social standing. And then, of course, there's the Eucharist, the most sacred of Christian meals. It wasn't just a tradition, it was the central act of Christian worship, where believers gathered to partake in the body and blood of Christ. In these early meals, Christians weren't just consuming physical food, they were participating in a spiritual act of communion with Christ. The bread and wine were more than sustenance, they were the very body and blood of Christ. And partaking in them was an expression of faith, a deep connection to the divine. The idea of the Eucharist becomes more widespread as the Church gains influence. While it was initially a private and intimate meal shared among small Christian communities, it grows into a key ritual in Christian worship by the 4th century. The Eucharist, at its heart, is about remembering Christ's sacrifice and the unity of the Christian community, but it's also about turning food into something holy, sacred, and transformative. The Eucharist had profound implications for the way early Christians viewed food. It wasn't just about what you ate, but why you ate and who you ate with. It redefined the very purpose of food from a commodity or a means of indulgence to a way of connecting with the divine. Food, in this context, wasn't merely about filling your stomach. It was about communion, fellowship, and the shared experience of God's grace. The more you think about it, the more you realize that Christianity didn't just alter what people ate, it altered their entire relationship with food. It moved food from being a status symbol to being a symbol of humility, charity, and community. The Christian meal, whether a simple meal of bread and wine or the sacred act of the Eucharist, became a powerful tool for spiritual transformation. As Christianity continued to spread through the empire, these new practices, humble meals, charity, hospitality, and the Eucharist became integral to Christian identity. The Church's influence on Roman dining culture was profound, not just in the foods Christians ate, but in how they viewed eating and sharing food. The act of eating, once a marker of power, now became a sacred act of fellowship, a way to participate in the life of Christ and in the Christian community. By now, you're beginning to see the broad impact that Christianity has had on the culture of food. It's not just about dietary restrictions or new rituals. It's about reimagining food as a symbol of spiritual devotion. Food is no longer just about filling the stomach. It's about nourishing the soul. The quiet rhythm of the night settles deeper, and as you reflect, the meaning behind each bite of food grows ever more profound. The way early Christians reshaped food culture isn't just a story of dietary rules or rituals. It's a story of how the very act of eating became a reflection of faith, a tool for community, and a way of marking the sacredness of life itself. The change wasn't just about replacing Roman feasts with humble meals. It was about bringing new significance to food, redefining its purpose, and elevating it to something spiritual. One of the most significant aspects of Christianity's influence on Roman food culture is the development of fasting. As you've seen, Fasting wasn't a new concept for the Romans. They had fasted for various reasons, often to honor gods, prepare for a major festival, or cleanse the body. But for Christians, fasting takes on a much more spiritual tone. It becomes less about bodily purification and more about aligning oneself with the spiritual journey of Christ. The Christian practice of fasting became central to the liturgical calendar, particularly around major feast days like Easter and Christmas. Christians were encouraged to fast as a way to prepare spiritually for these celebrations. The fast wasn't just about abstaining from food, it was about self-denial, reflection, and drawing closer to God. The act of fasting was also deeply tied to humility. By refraining from indulgence, Christians aimed to remember Christ's own sacrifices, his 40 days of fasting in the wilderness, his suffering on the cross, and to focus on spiritual nourishment rather than physical indulgence. Yet, as you might expect, fasting wasn't always easy. Roman feasts had been a spectacle of excess and indulgence. The rich and powerful were accustomed to grand meals with every conceivable delicacy, and now Christians were being asked to voluntarily limit their food, to sacrifice their desires, and to focus on the spiritual rather than the material. This shift in perspective would have felt jarring to many, but it also created a deep sense of community. Fasting together became a form of solidarity, a shared experience that bound early Christians closer to one another and to Christ. It's also worth noting that fasting was seen as a way of sharpening one's spiritual focus. The empty stomach, instead of being a symbol of lack, it was turned into a symbol of readiness, a willingness to be filled not by food, but by the Holy Spirit. As Christians fasted, they were also deepening their connection to Christ's own sacrifice, reinforcing the idea that food is not the ultimate sustenance, God's word and presence are. But fasting wasn't all about denial, it was also about transformation. After a period of fasting came the feast. Easter, for instance, marked the end of the Lenten fast, and Christians would celebrate the resurrection of Christ with a meal. This was not just any meal, it was a meal that reflected both the end of the fast and the triumph of Christ over death. The foods served at these feasts were often the ones that had been forbidden during the fast: meats, eggs, and dairy. It was a return to abundance, but a return marked by gratitude, not excess. The feast became a way to celebrate the grace of God, the gift of life, and the promise of eternal life. As you think about these transitions, you realize that fasting and feasting became more than just rituals. They became ways of thinking about the world. The Romans had seen food as a way to celebrate their power and wealth. But for Christians, food became a symbol of grace, humility, and transformation. Fasting wasn't just about avoiding pleasure, it was about embracing a deeper, spiritual reality. Feasting wasn't about indulging in excess, it was about recognizing and celebrating the abundance of God's love and salvation. But what's even more interesting is how these new practices of fasting and feasting transformed the social fabric of the empire. The Roman banquet, traditionally a space for the wealthy to display their status, gradually gave way to a more communal, egalitarian approach to meals. It's not that Christians rejected the act of feasting altogether, it's that they transformed it into a more spiritually meaningful event. Meals were no longer spaces where social distinctions were highlighted. They became opportunities for fellowship and unity, regardless of wealth or status. Take a moment to imagine the community gatherings that would have occurred in early Christian homes. The wealthy Roman elite, once used to feasting with their social equals, now sat alongside the poor, the outcasts, and the marginalized. They shared bread, wine, and simple food, and in doing so, they participated in a collective act of humility and devotion. There were no grand displays of wealth at these meals, only the shared experience of faith. Food became the great leveler, a tool to break down the barriers that once separated the rich from the poor. At the same time, the Eucharist, central to Christian worship, transformed the very nature of communal dining. It was no longer about impressing guests with fine dishes. It was about communion with Christ and with the community of believers. The Eucharist was not just a meal, it was an act of remembrance, an opportunity to commune with God and with one another in a deeply spiritual way. And in this simple meal of bread and wine, Christians found a profound connection to Christ's sacrifice and to the unity of the Christian community. You realize, as you reflect, that these meals, whether communal feasts, simple fasting, or the sacred Eucharist, became the foundation of a new way of thinking about food. Food was no longer just for the body, it was for the soul. It was a vehicle for transformation, a way of aligning oneself with Christ's journey, and a means of building community. The cultural shift you're witnessing isn't just about food. It's about a reimagining of how the Roman world viewed life, death, and the divine. Christianity didn't just change what people ate, it changed how they viewed eating. It became a tool for spiritual reflection, a means of connecting with the divine, and a way of embodying Christ's love in daily life. And in this transformation, food went from being a symbol of indulgence to a symbol of grace, humility, and love. As the fire crackles softly in the background, the room feels warmer, more intimate. You pause for a moment, contemplating how the act of eating, once a simple necessity, has become so rich with meaning. In early Christian communities, food was no longer just for survival, pleasure, or socializing. It was a medium for spiritual expression. The more you think about it, the more you realize that Christianity didn't simply change the content of Roman meals. It transformed the very essence of the communal act of eating. The transformation of food rituals goes beyond fasting and feasting. It also reaches deep into the symbolism of food. Christianity reimagines the act of sharing a meal. It takes the Roman practice of communal feasts and recontextualizes it in a new light. What was once a marker of social status is now a marker of equality and love. The Christian meal is an act of devotion, a symbol of unity among believers, and a direct reflection of Christ's teachings on love, equality, and sacrifice. In ancient Rome, the banquet was a public display of wealth and power. The host would demonstrate his status through lavish meals, and guests would be treated to a spectacle of extravagance. These meals, while an opportunity for socializing, were also about reinforcing social hierarchies. But Christianity began to upend this tradition by placing value not on what you had, but on who you shared your meal with. The early Christian meal was about inclusion, sharing what little one had with others, especially those who were poor or marginalized. This shift in how food is viewed and shared also reflects the changing understanding of hospitality. The Romans saw hospitality as an act of generosity, but it was also tied to social expectations and often used to cement one's social standing. For early Christians, however, hospitality took on a different meaning. It was about serving others, regardless of their social status. The early Christians emphasized the value of feeding the hungry, caring for the poor, and sharing food, not for the sake of prestige, but for the sake of showing Christ's love. It was a radical act of service, a commitment to equality, and a reflection of the way Christ had lived his life. Christian communities understood that food was sacred, not because it was abundant, but because it was shared in love and humility. You can almost picture the simple meals in early Christian homes: bread, olives, fish, a small portion of wine, and the knowledge that this was more than sustenance. It was a tangible manifestation of the body of Christ, shared with one another to reflect the love of the Savior. This idea of food as sacred is deeply intertwined with the concept of Eucharist, where the bread and wine are no longer mere food, but the very essence of Christ's sacrifice. By consuming the Eucharist, Christians connect directly with Christ's body and blood. This idea would be unthinkable in the Roman banquet halls, where food was about consumption and display. In Christianity, food becomes an act of participation in the divine, an opportunity to reflect on Christ's life and death, and to bring the community together in fellowship. But what happens when this practice of sharing food spreads across the empire? It starts to transform not just the way Christians eat, but the way they live. The communal meals, the feasts, the Eucharist, all of these practices begin to impact the social fabric of the Roman Empire. As Christianity grows, so does its influence on everyday life, especially in the way people approach food, hospitality, and social structures. The idea of communal eating becomes a powerful tool for Christian communities to bond with one another. In the early years, Christians often met in secret, worshipping in homes or in catacombs. These early Christian communities, though small, found strength in shared meals. They weren't just breaking bread together, they were creating bonds of fellowship and unity that transcended class, status, or background. The act of eating together became a tangible sign of the kingdom of God, a place where all are welcome, where there is no rich or poor, only brothers and sisters in Christ. As Christianity spread, the idea of a Christian meal as a tool for social change grew stronger. In the Roman world, meals were still often about hierarchy, status, and wealth, but the Christian tradition countered this by placing emphasis on what one could give rather than what one could consume. Early Christians were encouraged to serve those in need, especially the poor. The wealthy were urged to give food to those who were hungry, to invite the marginalized into their homes, and to break bread with the outcasts. This act of communal sharing, especially for those with little to offer, was a radical departure from Roman norms. Christianity, through its communal meals, challenged the social order of the empire by emphasizing the dignity and worth of every person, regardless of their economic status. Even as Christianity became more institutionalized and began to gain political power, these values of simplicity and charity continued to shape the Christian approach to food. By the time Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, Christian food practices had permeated not just the church but also society at large. The empire was still very much defined by its complex social hierarchies, but the Christian ethos of humility, charity, and shared meals had made significant inroads into how people viewed food and one another. And perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of Christianity's influence on Roman food culture is the concept of fasting. While fasting had been practiced in various forms throughout Roman society, Christianity gave it a distinct purpose. As mentioned earlier, fasting wasn't just about abstaining from food. It was about aligning oneself spiritually with Christ's journey. It became a way of emulating Christ's own sacrifice, as well as an act of self-discipline and spiritual purification. By the 4th century, fasting had become an integral part of Christian life, marking significant periods in the liturgical calendar. such as Lent, and forming a key part of the spiritual journey for believers. The Christian transformation of food culture didn't just affect the upper classes, it reached all layers of society. The importance of sharing simple, communal meals and caring for the poor was preached not just to the wealthy, but to all. Food became a unifying force, an expression of unity and love in a fragmented world. The humble meal, shared with others in faith, became a profound way to experience and embody the love of Christ. The Christian meal, in its simplicity and shared nature, set the stage for a future where the focus was not on indulgence or consumption, but on spiritual nourishment and community. The soft clinking of bowls and the whisper of passing bread fill the air. It's late now, and the world outside is hushed. But inside this imagined Roman Christian home, you feel a pulse, a steady, gentle rhythm of something new being born. You're not just watching people eat, you're watching a cultural revolution simmer in clay pots and wooden spoons. Christianity isn't just transforming beliefs, it's reshaping the very culture of taste. Let's get one thing clear. Ancient Roman cuisine was not bland. This is a civilization that brought you fish sauce garum on almost everything, exotic spices from faraway lands, and techniques that could rival any modern kitchen. But Roman food also reflected Roman values: conquest, indulgence, a spectacle. Wealthy Romans dined like emperors every day, flaunting spices that traveled thousands of miles, meats from exotic creatures, and dishes arranged like art. Eating was performance, but with the spread of Christianity, the performance started to feel unnecessary, maybe even empty. The Christian table didn't need imported cinnamon or peacock tongues. It needed meaning. So, what started to disappear from Roman tables as Christianity took hold? First, there was a noticeable decline in overtly indulgent ingredients. Those spices from India still used, but less flaunted. Peacock and flamingo tongues, not exactly staple Christian fare. Dishes that were once designed to shock and impress slowly began to feel inappropriate in a faith grounded in humility. It's not that Christians hated flavor, they just believed food should nourish the soul as much as the body. And then, there's the matter of how the food was seasoned. Roman cooks loved complex, layered sauces, many based on garum. A pungent fish sauce made by fermenting anchovies in the sun. It was like the ketchup of the Roman world, ubiquitous, salty, and kind of addictive. But early Christian diets, especially during fasting, leaned toward plainer flavors: lentils, grains, flatbreads, and mild vegetables became the norm. During fasts, garum was even avoided in stricter communities, and oil and salt were often used sparingly. The goal: simplicity, intention, not masking flavors with extravagance, but tasting what God had provided in its natural form. But even more than ingredients, Christianity challenged how food was used. Roman banquets often ended in excess vomiting to make room for more. Gluttony disguised as celebration. In Christian circles, this was seen as spiritual decay. One early church father, John Chrysostom, once said that overeating dulled the soul, calling it the mother of all diseases. Harsh, maybe, but you see the point. Christians weren't just trying to eat differently, they were trying to live differently. Let's not pretend, though, that everyone switched diets overnight. Many Roman Christians still enjoyed rich foods, especially those in the upper class. But over time, cultural pressure mounted. As the church grew in power, It began to influence more than just personal behavior. It started guiding public life, including how feasts were organized and what was considered socially acceptable. Public displays of indulgence became increasingly frowned upon, while acts of charity, like feeding the poor, were celebrated as Christian virtue. And there was an odd but fascinating side effect to this shift. Food started showing up in places it never had before in religious art. Hymns and sermons. Grapes and wheat began to symbolize more than food. They became representations of Christ himself. The image of the vine and branches, the broken bread, the cup. These weren't just metaphors anymore. They were spiritual truths, edible theology. So every meal had the potential to be a sermon. Every bite could be a reminder. Still, historians argue whether this shift was entirely spiritual or partially political. Was the move toward modest food really about purity and humility, or was it also about distancing the church from its pagan past? Pagan temples had their feasts, too lavish meals offered to the gods. Maybe Christians were trying to set themselves apart. We don't worship with meat and wine. Their actions seem to say, we worship with fasting and bread. The debate continues. But even within Christianity, food practice wasn't uniform. Some communities embraced extreme fasting whole days without food or even water, while others allowed for local customs. What one region might consider essential, say, fish on Fridays, another might see as optional. There were fierce discussions in some Christian circles about whether shellfish counted as meat, or whether olive oil was indulgent during fasts. You think today's dietary arguments are heated? Try getting between a 4th century monk and his Lent-approved soup. One of the more surprising developments was the rise of monastic cuisine. In Christian monasteries across the empire, food wasn't just sustenance, it was a way of life. Monks and nuns often grew their own vegetables, baked their own bread, and followed strict rules about when and how they could eat. Silence during meals, limited seasoning, shared portions. It was all designed to cultivate discipline and humility. Meals were part of their spiritual training, not a reward. And out of these simple kitchens came some long-lasting contributions to Western food culture. Ever heard of cheese aged in caves, thank a monk? Or bread baked with religious symbols etched on top? Monastic bakers were among the first to do that. While monks lived simply, they also lived intentionally, and their quiet culinary contributions echoed far beyond their stone walls. So yes, Christianity curtailed some of Rome's culinary flair, but it also introduced a new kind of richness. Not a richness of flavor, but a richness of purpose. Food wasn't just for the elite anymore. It became a form of prayer, a way of caring for others, a bridge between the physical and the divine. As you stretch and yawn, letting the evening settle in, you see now how this isn't just a history of ingredients. It's a story about meaning, how one belief system took the Roman obsession with food and turned it inside out. Instead of asking, how much can I have, Christians began asking, who can I share this with? Instead of chasing taste, they pursued truth. And instead of honoring the gods with lavish offerings, they honored Christ with simple bread, shared in love. You lie there, eyes fluttering, but mind still hungry, not for food, but for the kind of clarity that comes from understanding how deep a simple loaf of bread can go. So far, you've seen how Christianity toned down Rome's over-the-top food culture, but now we're shifting into something even more intriguing, the evolution of early Christian communal spaces, the kitchens, dining rooms, and makeshift chapels where faith and food were blended into a single, sacred act. Picture this: a dim, candlelit room in a modest Roman domus. There's the faint scent of herbs and oil, a few loaves of flatbread wrapped in linen, a bowl of olives on a low table, and, at the center, a cup of wine that's being passed carefully from hand to hand. It's quiet, no music, no servants clattering dishes, just whispers of prayer. This isn't just dinner, this is worship. Before grand basilicas and ornate cathedrals, Christian worship was intensely personal and home-based. The house church wasn't just a religious loophole, it was a deliberate return to intimacy, to the roots of communion. The domus, or Roman home, became a sacred space, not just for prayer, but for eating together in a way that dissolved the usual social rules. There was no triclinium hierarchy, no gold-plated plates. Everyone sat as equals. Women, slaves, merchants, children. No one had the best seat, because everyone had a place at Christ's table. In fact, this domestic approach to worship did something radical. It pulled the sacred into the everyday. The table you ate at by candlelight became your altar. The meal you cooked with leftover lentils and herbs was now liturgical, in blending the divine and the domestic. Early Christians were essentially rewriting the script on what holiness looked like. It didn't need marble temples or incense-filled sanctuaries. It needed bread, community, and a quiet room where everyone was welcome. Historians still argue whether this home-based structure was more about safety or symbolism. After all, Christianity was illegal for much of its early history. Gathering in homes was discreet, protected from prying imperial eyes. But many scholars believe there was also something beautifully deliberate in choosing the home as the sacred center. Jesus had broken bread in homes. After all, not in palaces or forums. The apostles had taught around kitchen tables and shared meals with widows and tax collectors. The early church, it seems, wanted to preserve that closeness, and with it came some culinary creativity. You start seeing foods being repurposed for symbolic meaning. Bread, of course, becomes the body. Wine, the blood. But there's more. Fish, once a regular protein in Roman diets, becomes a coded Christian symbol, ichthys, painted on walls and carved into door frames. Honey and milk begin to appear in baptismal feasts, symbolizing spiritual rebirth. Even simple herbs like rue and hyssop take on sacred connotations, used during purification rituals or sprinkled over meals as a quiet nod to biblical tradition. Meanwhile, communal kitchens, once the realm of household slaves, begin to take on a spiritual dimension. Christians gather to cook together, to prepare meals for the poor, or to ready the table for the Eucharist. The act of chopping onions or baking bread becomes a liturgy of its own. Every task, no matter how small, is done in love and with purpose. Food becomes not just a necessity, but a holy service. This emerging culture of shared meals and sacred kitchens starts to catch the eye of the broader Roman public. To some, it looks odd. Why would these people eat in such a humble way? Where's the entertainment? Where's the indulgence? But to others, it's magnetic. Here was a community that truly shared, where the rich gave freely and the poor were not pitied but invited, where no one left, hungry not in stomach, not in spirit. One fringe but fascinating account comes from a Roman noblewoman named Proba, who converted to Christianity in the 4th century. She reportedly turned her luxurious villa into a Christian gathering space, hosting modest meals and helping organize food distribution for the poor. Stories like hers show how powerful this new food ethic had become. It even drew in Rome's elite, not just through preaching, but through the witness of a shared meal done right. As Christianity became more visible and tolerated, these house-based meals began to evolve. Liturgical structures formed, prayers were formalized. The bread and wine were no longer just symbolic, they were consecrated. The small, intimate suppers of early Christians gradually gave way to more structured, Eucharistic feasts, sometimes held in converted villas or, later, dedicated church spaces. But the DNA of that early house church meal, the simplicity, the equality, the centrality of food never disappeared. In fact, it became the model for Christian hospitality. Moving forward, the church began to open up, not just spiritual guidance, but literal food programs. By the late 4th century, some bishops were organizing daily meals for the needy. Diaconal services, think ancient church-run food banks, started to appear, feeding widows, orphans, the sick, and travelers. And it all started with loaves of bread passed hand to hand in someone's dining room. Of course, not everything was perfectly serene. As the church grew in influence and wealth, there were tensions. Some clergy grew fond of luxurious living. Feasts returned, but now in bishops' residences instead of senators' villas. Certain Christian leaders warned against festival Christianity, where people showed up just for the food and not the faith. One bishop even joked that some believers treated the Eucharist like an early brunch. The tension between spiritual depth and social appetite was real. Still, the early Christian house meal left a lasting legacy. It redefined what sacred space could be. It transformed ordinary homes into sites of worship, and it proved that a meal simple, shared, and sincere could carry more theological weight than any temple offering. It was radical, quiet, and deeply human. So as you lie back now, cozy under your blanket, just imagine that flickering room again. The low voices, the warm bread, the wine shared without show. That was church. That was dinner. And in that convergence, Christianity found its rhythm, one spoonful of grace at a time. The fire of thought still burns low and steady. And as you stay tucked into your blanket of curiosity, you start to realize something profound. The Christian meal wasn't just different from Roman tradition. It was a quiet revolution that reached even the empire's fringes. It spread, not through swords or slogans, but through bread and bowls, through shared hunger and hospitality. And perhaps no group carried this transformation further, or more creatively, than the Christian monks. Welcome to the world of early Christian monasticism, where food became philosophy, cooking became contemplation, and the kitchen was as sacred as the chapel. Now, if you're imagining a bunch of grumpy, robe-wearing guys mumbling into their barley stew, let's pump the brakes. Yes, they wore robes. Yes, they were silent a lot, but they were also innovators, culinary curators of simplicity. Monastic communities shaped what people thought Christian food should be: humble, purposeful, and nourishing in both body and spirit. Monasticism bloomed in the 4th and 5th centuries, right as Christianity was transitioning from an underground movement to an institutional religion, and with it came a radical lifestyle: monks and nuns living apart from the world, devoting their lives to prayer, labor, and yes, food. But not food in the way Romans knew it. There were no banquets, no spitisotis, No juggling servants or dancing girls. Instead, there were schedules, gardens, root vegetables, silence, and a whole new theology of the table, the rule of Saint Juan, Benedict, written in the early 6th century and still influential today, offers an entire blueprint for how monks should eat. Spoiler, not a lot. Meals were usually vegetarian, eaten twice a day, one in winter, and ideally, without meat from four-legged animals. This wasn't just about health, it was about discipline. Appetite, according to Benedict, had to be tamed like a wild horse. The goal wasn't to punish the body, but to keep it from ruling the soul. And yet, for all their restraint, monks weren't joyless. Far from it. They saw cooking as sacred labor. Tending the herb garden was a kind of prayer. Stirring the stew was a meditation. Even washing dishes became an act of humility. The kitchen was considered a spiritual training ground, a place to kill pride with a ladle and nurture compassion over boiling pots. This approach had a ripple effect. As monasteries grew in influence, their food culture started to shape the larger Christian world. Outside the cloister walls, lay people looked to the monks for guidance. If monks abstained from meat during Lent, so did communities. If monks blessed their bread before meals, others followed suit. Monasteries became the standard bearers for Christian food ethics, pioneering what we'd now call sustainable, local, and mindful eating long before it became trendy. Fun fact, monks were also some of the earliest brewers and cheesemakers in Europe. They didn't just make food, they preserved knowledge. While barbarian invasions burned cities and libraries, monasteries were quietly copying recipes, improving agricultural methods, and developing the art of fermentation. That fancy wheel of aged cheese, or that Belgian ale you love on Fridays. Yeah, you've got a hooded monk to thank. But here's a quirky detail. Monks didn't always get fasting right. Some communities found hilarious loopholes in the fasting rules. One monastic group in Gaul decided that if you liquefied meat and drank it like soup, it didn't count as breaking the fast. Others insisted that cold meat was technically not meat. The spirit was willing, but the appetite was sneaky. Monastic food customs were taken seriously, but let's be honest, they also got creatively interpreted from time to time. Historians still debate whether monastic food rules were more about spiritual growth or social control. Some argue that strict diets helped reinforce hierarchy and order in the community. Others say the goal was to imitate Christ's suffering and humility, probably a little of both. But what's undeniable is that monks changed how Christians thought about food. They proved that simplicity could be beautiful, that discipline could be freeing, and that eating could be an act of worship. Meanwhile, monastic hospitality became legendary. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor could find a warm meal and a clean bed behind monastery gates. The kitchen wasn't just for the monks, it was for anyone in need. Feeding strangers was seen as feeding Christ himself. A reflection of the gospel's most radical call: love your neighbor, even if you just met them 5 minutes ago at the gate. And all this quiet, intentional life of fasting and feeding spread across the Christian world. From the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Ireland, monastic kitchens echoed with the soft sounds of cooking and prayer, and they set the tone for what Christian food would become for centuries: restrained, respectful, but never without meaning. So now, as the night grows deeper and your eyelids start to droop, think of that candlelit cell, the wooden spoon in a clay pot, the steam curling up like a whispered psalm. That was the monk's world. No fame, no fortune, just faith and food. and maybe a little too much turnip. The night is quiet, except for your breath and the low hum of thoughts still simmering. You've walked through the candlelit homes of early Christians and stood in the cloistered kitchens of monks. But now, the road opens wider, because something's changing not just inside churches or monasteries, but out there in the fields, in the markets, and at the tables of everyday people. The ripple of Christian food ethics is starting to soak into Roman society itself. And what began as a spiritual practice is becoming cultural architecture. This next stage of the story isn't about what Christians are doing differently. It's about how those differences begin to shape everything around them. The Roman Empire, once so proudly pagan and hedonistic, is now officially Christian, thanks to Emperor Constantine and his successors, and with that, Christianity's once radical ideas about food, fasting, and communal meals are becoming not just tolerated, but celebrated. Suddenly, what you eat and how you eat it isn't just personal, it's political. Public feasting, once a tool of imperial propaganda, starts to feel awkward. In the pagan world, emperors threw massive games and festivals to win favor, offering free bread, meat, and wine in spectacles that mixed religious ritual with civic duty. But as Christian values begin to take center stage, that kind of excess looks less like generosity and more like gluttony. The empire begins to pivot: fewer animal sacrifices, fewer public orgies of meat and drink. In their place, church, organized feasts for saints' days, fasts to mark holy seasons, and charity-driven banquets for the poor. That's right, banquets for the poor. This is a major shift. Under Roman norms, charity was mostly about reputation. Rich families might donate bread to score political points or to fund festivals that kept the masses in line. But Christianity brings in a new idea: charity as moral obligation. Feeding the hungry becomes not a favor to society, but a direct command from God. So local churches start organizing food relief on a scale never seen before. Bishops distribuent grains during famine. Deacons are tasked with feeding orphans and widows. Community kitchens modest. Busy places pop up beside churches, ladling out lentils and bread, especially during fasts and feast days. The clergy become not just spiritual leaders, but logistical coordinators of food justice. And here's the thing people notice. Non-Christians begin to remark on how Christians feed not just their own, but outsiders too. They care for our poor as well as theirs, wrote one pagan observer, half confused, half impressed. This is more than generosity. It's a quiet revolution. Roman society had always been stratified: gods at the top, slaves at the bottom, and food distribution followed that hierarchy. But now, Christian charity cuts through the system like a warm loaf through cold butter. Of course, not everyone's thrilled. Some traditional elites see this as social chaos. Why should a beggar get the same bread as a senator's son? Why should priests be feeding the poor instead of praying for the empire? But the church isn't trying to maintain Roman order. It's trying to model the kingdom of God. And in that kingdom, the last shall be first. And nobody eats alone. Even Christian holidays start reshaping the food calendar. Lent, Advent, and various saints' days come with fasting rules that affect not just believers, but the economy itself. Fishmongers rejoice during Lent. Markets adjust their inventories. Recipes evolve to meet the demand for meatless meals. You start seeing new dishes: cheese pies, almond milk stews, herbed grains designed specifically to satisfy, while still obeying the letter and spirit of fasting laws. This isn't just religious devotion anymore, it's food policy. And with food policy comes debate. Always debate. Historians still argue whether these changes improve nutrition and health. Some say the Christian diet, with its emphasis on grains, vegetables, and moderate portions, was healthier than the meat-heavy Roman fare. Others claim that rigid fasting periods led to binging afterward, or created stress around religious compliance. Either way, there's no denying the influence. Christianity had turned food into a structured rhythm of spiritual time feasting, fasting, feeding others, and giving thanks. One quirky trend, the rise of religious food taboos. While Christians didn't adopt Jewish kosher laws, they did develop their own list of problematic foods. Meat on Fridays. Nope. Rich sauces during Lent, better not. In some regions, eggs and dairy were even banned during certain fasts. This led to accidental culinary innovation. People got creative, making creamy dishes out of nuts, or sweetening desserts with dried fruit instead of honey. Fasting food didn't mean boring food, it just meant thoughtful food. And thoughtful food had staying power. As Christianity spread to the edges of the Empire Gaul, Iberia, Britannia, so did its culinary customs. Missionaries brought more than sermons. They brought recipes. Monks taught agriculture. Bishops taught fasting. Households slowly replaced pagan feasts with saint-day meals and fast-night broths. What started in the dining rooms of persecuted Christians was now echoing in every Roman province, reshaping taste itself. Even cookbooks shifted. You can trace how certain Roman recipes slowly fade from culinary texts, replaced by plainer, leaner dishes. Gone are the flamingo tongues. In come lentils with garlic and herbs. Meals are no longer described in terms of spectacle, but of balance and season. The cook becomes not an entertainer, but a caretaker. And yet, for all this evolution, something human remains. Christians still love to eat. They still gather, laugh, tell stories over meals. It's just that now, those meals are framed in humility, not dominance, in gratitude, not indulgence. So as the empire transforms, so too does the meaning of its meals. The Christian ethic: feed the hungry, eat simply, break bread in memory of Christ begins to outweigh the old Roman virtues of power, luxury, and show. And you, lying there wrapped in the quiet of night, start to see it all clearly. A loaf of bread is never just a loaf. A bowl of soup isn't just a meal. Each bite is history. Each sip is theology. And the table is where the empire changed. You're sinking deeper now, the weight of the past settling softly like dust on a window pane. What you've learned so far is that Christian food culture reshaped Rome in ways both subtle and seismic. But this next phase, it's about ritualizing that shift, about how meals, once casual or political, became deeply symbolic in Christian worship and daily life. Think of it as the gospel according to gastronomy, where every bite is a message and every shared meal a sermon. The most obvious centerpiece is, of course, the Eucharist, the ritual meal where bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. This isn't just a meal, it's a reenactment, a mystery, a declaration of faith baked into the bread and poured into the cup. Early Christians transformed the simple act of eating into a cosmic event, a bridge between heaven and earth. You probably won't survive this revelation without thinking twice about your next sandwich. It's easy to overlook how radical this was. Romans were no strangers to ritual meals. Pagans feasted for their gods. Emperors staged lavish banquets to display power, but none of those meals claimed to be a direct, living connection to the divine presence. The Eucharist did, and it wasn't about abundance or extravagance. It was about simplicity, humility, and community. Picture the first Eucharist, a small gathering, probably in a home, bread broken and wine shared. The participants are not distinguished by wealth or status. They are brothers and sisters, bound by a new covenant. Eating this bread is an act of remembrance and unity. It's theology you can chew on. Historians still argue whether the earliest Eucharistic practices involved full meals or just symbolic servings. Some evidence suggests that agape feasts, love meals, were communal dinners that included the Eucharist but also regular food. Others believe the Eucharist was always a distinct solemnita. Either way, the meal became central to Christian identity, and with the Eucharist came new food rules. Fasting before communion became common, an idea borrowed from Jewish practice, but developed uniquely within Christianity. Believers began to fast for hours, or even a full day before receiving the sacrament, cultivating a sense of preparation and reverence. This fasting wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. You weren't just clearing your stomach, you were opening your soul. That fasting discipline bled into wider Christian practice. Lent, Advent, and other seasons acquired fasting rules that shaped entire diets. And it wasn't just about giving things up. The goal was transformation, clearing distractions, so the soul could feast on God's presence. Quirky little rituals popped up too. In some communities, the leftover Eucharistic bread, called the antidoron, was given to the faithful who didn't receive communion, creating a broader shared experience. Other churches bake special communion breads, shaped like fish or crosses, making the sacred edible in playful, meaningful ways. Food symbolism exploded. Bread was Christ's body, wine, his blood, but so were water, salt, honey, and even garlic. Each ingredient could be layered with spiritual meaning, deepening the sensory connection to faith. Yet, all these sacred food practices sparked debates. Some early church leaders worried that the agape feasts became occasions for excess and scandal, reminiscent of pagan banquets. Others felt fasting rules were too harsh or inconsistent across regions. These tensions reflected a larger struggle: how to hold on to the mystery of the meal while keeping community order beyond the Eucharist. Daily Christian life was dotted with food rituals that reinforced faith and identity. Blessings before and after meals became routine, a way to recognize God's provision in the mundane. Certain foods were reserved for holy days. Mealtime prayers created a rhythm of gratitude that shaped Christian households. And it's here that the Christian meal also became a tool of cultural separation. Eating practices marked boundaries between believers and pagans. For instance, Christians avoided meat, sacrificed to idols, no matter how tasty. This wasn't just about piety, but about declaring membership in a new, distinct community. Your plate became your badge. A curious note: some early Christian communities went further, refusing to eat meat altogether, or adopting vegetarian diets as an expression of purity. Others allowed moderate meat consumption, but enforced strict fasting periods. This diversity shows how food was flexible but always meaningful. This ritualization also brought about new social norms. Sharing food with fellow Christians reinforced bonds. Excluding outsiders from meals maintained group identity. Hospitality took on sacramental weight. The home table and church altar blurred together, both spaces where God's presence was invoked through food. You might think this makes Christian dining rigid or joyless, but that's not the whole story. Celebrations remained vibrant feasts for Easter and Christmas, communal meals after baptisms, and saints' days that combined festivity with faith. The difference was intention. Food was never just food. It was a language of love, sacrifice, and hope. So, as you breathe in the quiet of this growing night, think of how the simple act of breaking bread carried centuries of meaning, how a slice of bread, dipped in wine, became an altar, a sacrament, a revolution, and how through these sacred meals, Christianity carved out a new way to taste the divine. The night is thickening, and you're settling deeper into the rhythm of this slow unraveling of history. You've tasted the sacred, witnessed the fasting, to felt the gentle power of food as faith. Now, let's turn to a less solemn, but equally important side of this story, the Christian influence on practical cooking and everyday eating habits in the late Roman world. Christianity didn't just reinvent sacred meals, it quietly reworked the kitchen and pantry of ordinary people. You might be surprised to hear that the once glamorous Roman culinary scene, known for exotic spices, elaborate sauces, and showy banquets, began to shift towards simpler, more modest fare influenced by Christian ethics. At the heart of this transformation was the growing preference for vegetarian and meatless meals, especially during fasts. While not all Christians were vegetarians, the emphasis on abstaining from meat during Lent and other fasts pushed cooks to get creative. Lent wasn't just a spiritual exercise, it became a driver of culinary innovation. Think of it as the original Meatless Mondays, but with much higher stakes. Farmers, fishmongers, and merchants began to cater to these needs, stocking markets with an abundance of fish, legumes, grains, and fresh vegetables. The Christian fasting calendar created a rhythm that shaped what was grown, sold, and cooked. Fish, in particular, gained a new cultural cachet. It wasn't just a food, it became a symbol of Christ himself, thanks to the Greek word ichthys, an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. This symbolism wasn't lost on cooks, who started incorporating fish into everyday meals more frequently, both out of faith and necessity. You can almost imagine the chatter in Roman fish markets. Got your fast-friendly mackerel here, fresh and holy. It was a practical shift with spiritual weight. Yet, Christian food culture wasn't uniformly austere. There's plenty of evidence that celebratory meals could be lush and joyful, especially on feast days, like Easter. Families gathered to share special dishes, including eggs, another potent symbol of resurrection and new life. Eggs were often dyed or decorated, echoing rituals that feel surprisingly familiar today. Here's a quirky aside. Some Christians adapted pagan traditions to suit their new faith. For example, the spring egg hunts and feasts might have pagan origins, but Christians layered them with new meanings, turning old symbols into celebrations of Christ's victory over death. Food became a bridge between past and present. The kitchen tools and techniques also evolved. Monks and Christian households alike valued slow cooking, boiling, and stewing over frying or roasting, reflecting both modesty and practicality. New recipes emphasized wholesome, nourishing ingredients that supported the body and spirit alike. Historians still debate how much these Christian cooking habits actually replaced traditional Roman cuisine. Some argue that elite Romans clung to their extravagant meals until the very end, while others see a more gradual blending of Christian and Roman tastes. Either way, the influence is clear in the surviving cookbooks and archaeological remains. Another fascinating tidbit: some Christian communities experimented with honey and herbs as natural sweeteners and flavorings, avoiding expensive spices that were linked to pagan luxury. This gave rise to distinct flavors, simple, fresh, and rooted in local ingredients. Food sharing also took on a new ethical dimension. Feeding the poor wasn't just charity, it was a sign of true community. Early Christians opened their homes to neighbors, strangers, and the marginalized, offering meals that united rather than divided. This was radical in a society deeply split by class and status. You can almost hear the clatter of pots in those crowded homes, the laughter of children, and the whispered prayers over shared loaves. It was a world where faith flavored every meal, and every table told a story of belonging. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the scent of simmering lentils, the taste of fresh bread dipped in olive oil, the warmth of a meal that feeds more than just the body. This was the daily reality of Christian influence: quiet, profound, and deliciously human. The night deepens, and with it, your journey carries you further into the subtle ways Christianity reshaped not only what people ate, but how they thought about food and health. We've seen monks in their cloisters, believers fasting and feasting, and everyday kitchens shifting in rhythm. Now, let's lean into the fascinating interplay between Christian attitudes and Roman medicine, nutrition, and hygiene. Where food was more than fuel, it was medicine for body and soul. Romans took their health seriously, boasting a medical tradition with names like Galen and Hippocrates echoing through their baths and apothecaries. But Christian thinkers added new layers to this ancient wisdom, blending classical ideas with spiritual insights that reframed food as a moral as well as physical substance. In Christian teaching, the body was a temple of the Holy Spirit, and caring for it meant balancing nourishment with restraint. Food was a gift, but also a test. Overindulgence was seen as a path to sin, moderation, a sign of holiness. This spiritualizing of diet aligned with medical advice to avoid extremes, but gave it an ethical charge. Eating well wasn't just healthy, it was righteous. Monastic manuals reflected this. Recipes and fasting rules aimed not only to sustain, but to purify. Some early Christian physicians and monks believed certain foods could enhance spiritual clarity, while others warned that rich foods clouded the mind and spirit. Garlic and onions, for example, and were often avoided for their strong odors and supposed negative spiritual effects. At the same time, the church embraced healing practices. Prayers for the sick often accompanied meals, and food was part of recovery rituals. Simple broths, barley water, and herbal infusions became staples of Christian healing, especially in monastic infirmaries. There's a quirky detail here. Some monks believed that eating bitter herbs could help fight off temptation, like a natural spiritual detox. It's like the ancient equivalent of kale smoothies, only with more prayers and fewer Instagram likes. Historians still argue whether Christian dietary prescriptions improved health or were more symbolic. Some evidence suggests that fasting improved longevity and resilience, while other scholars caution that rigid fasting might have caused malnutrition in vulnerable populations. Either way, the idea that food affected both body and soul became central to Christian practice. Hygiene was also wrapped up in these beliefs. Cleanliness was next to godliness. Literally, wash basins appeared in monasteries not just for ritual purification, but as part of health routines. Pilgrims were encouraged to wash before meals, and the sharing of communal dishes was often accompanied by hand-washing rituals, distinguishing Christian customs from Roman habits. In this context, food preparation took on almost sacred significance. Handling food with care, washing hands, and blessing meals were all ways to honor God through the senses. Cooking wasn't a mundane chore, but a spiritual act. One fun anecdote: some Christian texts advised avoiding certain fish during specific fasts because they were thought to cause lust or anger, a reminder that food was believed to influence not only the body, but also the emotions and soul. As you imagine these worlds, picture a monk stirring a pot of barley soup while humming a psalm, or a mother carefully rinsing lentils before a family meal, whispering a blessing. This fusion of health, hygiene, and holiness was the new standard. Christianity didn't reject Roman medicine, it reinterpreted it, folding health into a grander narrative of salvation and discipline. The meal table became a place where physical nourishment met spiritual transformation, where healing was as much about grace as vitamins. So, as the night wraps around you like a soft cloak, I remember that the food on the ancient Christian table wasn't just about hunger. It was about hope, gare, and the quiet promise that body and soul could be sustained together, one blessed bite at a time. The darkness is settling comfortably now, and you're drifting deeper into a world where the scent of cooking fires mingles with the whispered prayers of early Christians. You've seen how faith shaped fasting, feasting, and health. But now, let's explore one of the more surprising ways Christianity influenced Roman food culture: the rise of communal kitchens and charity meals as a social revolution. Roman society had long been marked by inequality, with grand banquets for the wealthy and scraps for the poor. But Christianity's radical call to care for the needy began reshaping this picture. Suddenly, feeding the hungry was not just an act of kindness, it was a sacred duty. Picture this: early churches opening their doors to host communal meals, known as agape feasts or love feasts. These weren't just social gatherings, but acts of faith, where everyone was invited to break bread together, regardless of status. Imagine slaves, freedmen, and wealthy converts sitting side by side, sharing the same simple food in an act of spiritual equality. Historians still argue about the exact form and frequency of these agape feasts. Were they regular meals or special occasions? But what's clear is that they became a hallmark of Christian community life, emphasizing unity and charity. This practice challenged the old Roman norms, where social hierarchy dictated who ate what and with whom. In Christian meals, the table became a leveling ground, an earthly taste of the kingdom of God. The powerful were reminded to serve the weak, and the poor were given dignity through shared sustenance. Charitable kitchens soon sprang up, especially in larger cities like Rome and Alexandria. These kitchens distributed food daily to the poor and destitute, often overseen by church officials and deacons. Grain distributions, loaves of bread, the bowls of porridge, these became lifelines in tough times. A quirky detail: some early Christian texts describe how deacons carefully organized the distribution of food to avoid favoritism, using lists and assigned portions early bureaucrats of charity in action. It's a reminder that feeding thousands required more than goodwill. It demanded structure and care. Feeding the poor wasn't always universally accepted. Some Romans viewed these Christian charity meals with suspicion or disdain, seeing them as a threat to social order. But Christians held firm, arguing that food charity was a visible expression of God's love and justice. Over time, these charitable food practices influenced imperial policies. Emperors began to adopt Christian-inspired grain dole systems that aimed to provide basic sustenance to the population. You might say, Christians rewrote the Roman recipe for social welfare. On a more personal level, charity meals created new social bonds. They fostered a sense of belonging and support among marginalized groups, including widows, orphans, and the sick. The act of eating together became a way to heal not only hunger but social wounds. The influence of Christian charity meals stretched beyond the Roman Empire's borders. Missionaries carried these ideas to new lands, planting seeds for medieval almshouses, soup kitchens, and eventually the modern concept of organized charity. So as you feel your eyelids grow heavy, imagine a crowded church basement in ancient Rome, bowls passing from hand to hand, voices mingling in prayer and laughter. It's more than food, it's community. It's love made visible in bread and broth. This is one of Christianity's greatest gifts, the idea that no one should eat alone, and that the table is a place where faith and fellowship meet. The night's quiet rhythm carries you onward, into a time when the Christian kitchen wasn't just about feeding bodies, but shaping culture. By now, you've encountered fasting, feasting, charity, and sacred symbolism. But there's another story, simmering beneath the surface, the role of monasteries as culinary innovators and preservers of food knowledge. Monasteries were more than spiritual retreats. They were the medieval equivalent of research centers, agricultural hubs, and recipe laboratories. Picture stone walls surrounding herb gardens, monks carefully tending bees, and vast pantries stocked with preserved fruits, grains, and salted fish. Here, food was both a necessity and a craft. The monastic commitment to discipline extended to their diets, which were strictly regulated by centuries-old rules. For instance, the rule of St. Ais, Benedict prescribed modest meals, mostly vegetarian, with occasional fish, encouraging simplicity and restraint, but beyond restrictions. Monks experimented with preserving and preparing food to sustain long fasting periods. They mastered drying, salting, pickling, and fermenting techniques that kept food edible through cold winters and long journeys. Think of monks as early food scientists, developing methods still used today in pickles, cheeses, and cured meats. Monasteries also cultivated medicinal herbs, blending culinary and healing arts. Basil, thyme, rosemary, these weren't just flavor enhancers, but remedies for ailments. Monks recorded recipes that combined health and taste, proving that even in austerity, food could be nourishing and pleasurable. There's a charming irony here, monks, who took vows of poverty and abstinence, to become some of the most skilled chefs of their time. Some monasteries even gained reputations for their bread and beer, which pilgrims and locals sought out for their quality and spiritual blessing. Historians still debate how much monastic food culture influenced lay society versus remaining an isolated practice. But the evidence is clear. Monasteries were vital in preserving ancient Roman culinary knowledge and passing it forward, blending classical traditions with Christian values. Monks also helped spread Christian food customs across Europe, adapting Roman fasting rules to new climates and crops. Their monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, introducing new crops and farming techniques that shaped regional diets. And let's not forget the beer. Brewing was a monastic specialty, providing a safer alternative to often contaminated water. Some monks even claimed that beer was a gift from God to sustain their labors, holy hydration. If you will, the communal monastic meals were quiet affairs, usually eaten in silence or with readings from scripture. Food here was a reminder of humility and the shared journey towards salvation. No extravagant banquet, just simple, nourishing fare consumed with gratitude. As you settle further into this gentle night, picture the monastery kitchen, glowing with candlelight, the scent of fresh bread rising, and a monk carefully stirring a pot of vegetable stew. This was a place where faith and food intertwined, crafting a legacy that fed body, mind, and spirit for centuries to come. Through these cloistered walls, Christianity's influence on food deepened, linking sacred ritual with everyday sustenance, and ensuring that the flavors of faith would endure long past the fall of Rome. The night air cools as you slip further into the quiet world of ancient kitchens, where Christianity's imprint on food culture grows richer and more complex. We've traced the sacred meals, charity feasts, and monastic innovations now. Let's explore the subtle but potent influence Christianity had on food taboos, dietary restrictions, and how those shaped social boundaries in the late Roman Empire. You're already familiar with fasting and abstinence, but Christian dietary rules extended beyond those. Early Christians adopted and adapted Jewish food laws, rejecting certain animals, avoiding foods linked to pagan rituals, and creating new taboos based on theological reasoning. For example, meat sacrificed to idols was strictly off limits. This wasn't just a dietary choice, it was a spiritual line in the sand. Eating such meat would imply complicity with pagan worship, breaking the community's moral cohesion. This created tension. Imagine a Roman dinner party where Christian guests politely declined dishes without explaining why, sometimes causing confusion or offense. Food became a marker of identity, a way to say I belong here or I don't belong there. Interestingly, fish became the unofficial Christian protein. Its symbolic resonance and exemption from pagan sacrifice made it a dietary favorite. The fish symbol, ichthys, quietly declared faith at the dinner table. Historians still argue how strictly these taboos were observed across regions and social classes. Some evidence suggests wealthier Christians might have bent the rules, while others took them very seriously. This diversity shows how food was a battleground for faith and culture. Christianity also influenced attitudes toward alcohol. While wine remained a staple, drunkenness was condemned as sinful. Moderation was preached, aligning with broader calls for self-control and holiness. There's a quirky note here. Some Christian writers recommended diluting wine with water, both for health and temperance, a habit that Romans originally disdained as uncultured. Suddenly, diluted wine was the beverage of the faithful. Other food taboos related to fasting seasons, forbidding not just meat, but also dairy, eggs, and sometimes oil. These strict fasts forced creativity in the kitchen, turning simple grains, legumes, and vegetables into dishes with spiritual weight. Socially, these food restrictions reinforced group boundaries. Christians who kept kosher-like rules set themselves apart from pagans and Jews, while also uniting diverse ethnic groups under a shared practice. Food thus became a language of belonging and exclusion, a tool to define who was in and who was out. It also shaped marriage, hospitality, and community life. Knowing what your neighbor ate told you a lot about their faith and status. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the delicate dance at a Roman table, where food was both nourishment and message. The choices on the plate whispered faith, community, and identity, echoing louder than words. Through these everyday acts of eating and abstaining, Christianity quietly but firmly altered the social fabric of Rome, turning food into a symbol of spiritual belonging and separation. The night deepens, and you glide further into the world where food and faith intermingle in the fabric of Roman life. We've seen communal meals and taboos, but now you step into the kitchens and markets where Christianity subtly reshaped supply and demand, influencing agricultural production and trade networks across the empire. Imagine bustling Roman markets, where merchants once hawked exotic spices and rare delicacies for elite banquets. Christianity's rise brought new culinary priorities that rippled through these lively hubs. Fasting seasons, vegetarian preferences, and fish's symbolic status changed what buyers sought and sellers stocked. Farmers began focusing more on growing crops that suited Christian fasting and feasting patterns. Grains, legumes, vegetables, and fruits became staples. Olive oil and wine production adapted to religious uses, with wine also serving sacramental roles beyond mere consumption. Fishmongers thrived. Fish was no longer just a regional staple. Demand surged as it became the preferred protein during fasts and holy days. This demand reshaped fishing industries and even coastal economies. Historians still debate the scale of these shifts, whether Christian dietary rules sparked large-scale agricultural change or more modest market tweaks. But archaeological findings reveal increased fish remains in Christian sites and fewer remnants of luxury spices and meats. Christian leaders also encouraged local food production to ensure communities could sustain themselves, especially during times of persecution or war. Monasteries became agricultural centers, experimenting with crop rotation and animal husbandry, which boosted food security. There's a curious note. Some monks kept bees not only for honey but also for wax, essential for candles used in church rituals. So, a buzzing hive supported both food and faith in unexpected ways. Christianity's impact on trade wasn't just about crops and livestock. It affected how food was distributed. Charity kitchens required reliable supply chains, pushing merchants to deliver staple foods affordably and consistently. Meanwhile, the demand for certain foods declined. Exotic spices and costly meats linked to pagan banquets fell out of favor. This shift likely hurt some traders, but aligned markets with emerging Christian values of simplicity and humility. Food markets thus became microcosms of the broader cultural transformation. Buying and selling food wasn't just economic, it was part of a religious conversation, where choices reflected deeper commitments. As you sink deeper into this restful night, picture a Roman market, slowly changing fish stalls, bustling with faithful buyers, baskets brimming with lentils and barley, olive oil flowing steadily, all part of a quiet revolution shaped by faith and daily bread. Christianity didn't just change the dinner table, it reshaped the very sources of our food, weaving spirituality into the earth. Sea and market alike, the night wraps around you like a soft blanket, and you continue wandering through the lingering echoes of Roman kitchens and Christian rituals. You've explored the markets and monastic fields. Now, let's move to the intimate space of Christian households, where faith influenced daily eating customs, hospitality, and family life. In many Roman homes, meals were a social and spiritual event, and Christian families adapted these traditions to fit their beliefs. Hospitality became a sacred duty, not just a polite custom. Welcoming guests, even strangers to the table, was seen as a way to enact Christ's love in practical terms. Christian households followed fasting calendars carefully, structuring meals to honor holy days. This meant planning menus around abstinence and feasting, teaching children from an early age the rhythms of sacred eating. Imagine a family preparing lentil soup one evening and celebrating with eggs and cheese the next, each dish tied to deeper meanings. Mealtime prayers and blessings became routine, reinforcing the idea that food was a gift from God. Unlike some Roman banquets, which could be loud and lavish, Christian meals tended to be more modest and focused on gratitude. But modesty didn't mean monotone. Recipes incorporated local ingredients and seasonal produce, creating varied dishes that reflected both culture and faith. Fermented foods, pulses, and herbs featured prominently, offering nutrition and flavor without extravagance. Hospitality also included feeding the poor and travelers, echoing the earlier communal meals, but on a more personal scale. Many families kept extra bread or a pot of stew ready for unexpected guests, embodying the Christian ideal of charity at home. A quirky note: some Christian households reportedly avoided eating garlic and onions during communal meals to prevent unpleasant breath, early evidence that social dining etiquette was already a concern. You can almost hear the polite coughs at the dinner table. Historians still debate how widespread these household practices were, particularly among rural Christians versus urban elites. Some argue that traditional Roman customs persisted alongside Christian ones, creating a complex culinary landscape. Regardless, the influence of Christian values on family meals is undeniable. Food became a daily lesson in faith, hospitality, and community, shaping not just what was eaten, but how it was shared. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture a humble Roman kitchen, a family gathered around a wooden table, hands clasped in prayer, plates passing, laughter, soft but sincere. This was where Christianity lived and breathed through the simple, sacred act of breaking bread together. The night's calm deepens as you move gently through the streets and homes of late Roman society, where Christianity's influence seeped into more personal and social rituals tied to food, especially hospitality, gift-giving, and the etiquette of shared meals. Hospitality wasn't just a cultural nicety, it was a sacred obligation rooted in biblical teachings. Inviting strangers and neighbors to your table was seen as an expression of Christian charity and community building. The act of sharing food became a way to embody the gospel's call to love your neighbor. In this spirit, food gifts became common bread, olive oil, wine, or preserved foods were exchanged during festivals, visits, or as acts of support. This practice helped strengthen social ties and created a network of mutual aid within Christian communities, especially in times of hardship. Imagine the subtle negotiations of social standing that played out around these food exchanges. Offering too little might signal stinginess, too much could seem boastful. Food was language, a way to communicate generosity, respect, and belonging. Christian leaders encouraged these customs, but warned against excess or pride. Humility was key, so food gifts were meant to be practical and thoughtful rather than lavish. This was a stark contrast to the opulence of Roman aristocratic banquets. There's an amusing detail from some letters of the time. A certain bishop once gently chided a well-meaning Christian who sent too many sweets, fearing it might lead to gluttony. It's like the ancient version of less is more, but with honey cakes. Etiquette at Christian meals also evolved. Loud eating, interruptions, and showy displays were frowned upon, replaced by an atmosphere of respect and contemplation. Meals could be quiet, sometimes accompanied by scripture readings or hymns, a spiritual soundtrack to everyday nourishment. Historians still debate how widespread these norms were. Some evidence suggests that older Roman customs persisted, especially in rural areas, blending with Christian practices in a kind of culinary syncretism. Yet, the emphasis on hospitality, gift-giving, and respectful sharing marked a shift in how food related to community. It wasn't just about satiating hunger, it was a medium for expressing faith, forging bonds, and nurturing the soul. As you feel sleep pulling you deeper, picture a simple home where a basket of bread is offered to a weary traveler, hands gratefully accepting, eyes meeting in shared kindness. Here, food is not just sustenance, but a symbol of grace and connection. Through these quiet acts of sharing, Christianity rewrote the social script of Roman dining, turning tables into stages for compassion, humility, and belonging. The quiet night continues to cradle you as you follow the subtle traces of Christianity weaving through Roman culinary practices. This time, turning to the significant impact on public festivals and communal celebrations. Food was never just food, it was the centerpiece of ritual, social identity, and spiritual expression. And Christianity redefined how these feasts were conceived and experienced. Roman pagan festivals were famous for their extravagant banquets, often involving the sacrifice of animals and copious drinking. With the rise of Christianity, these traditional rites came under scrutiny, viewed increasingly as pagan excesses incompatible with the new faith's values. Christian leaders promoted alternative celebrations centered on modest meals, of prayer, and remembrance of Christian martyrs and saints. These holy days, often tied to the liturgical calendar, featured specific foods, symbolizing spiritual truths, such as bread and wine during the Eucharist. Imagine public celebrations transforming from noisy, bacchanalian spectacles to more sober gatherings, where sharing simple food reinforced faith and community. The emphasis shifted from indulgence to spiritual nourishment. Historians still debate how quickly and thoroughly these changes took root across the empire. In some regions, old pagan festivals persisted for centuries alongside Christian ones, creating a patchwork of practices. In others, Christian festivals outright replaced pagan feasts, shaping new cultural norms. An interesting tidbit: some Christian communities adopted certain elements of pagan feasts, but gave them new meaning. For example, communal meals during harvest festivals were reinterpreted as thanksgiving to God for blessings, blending continuity with change. Food at Christian festivals was often simple but meaningful: bread, fish, fruit, and wine. These meals were occasions to teach the faith and strengthen communal bonds. Especially in times of persecution or hardship, you can almost hear the whispered prayers mingling with the clink of pottery cups in a dimly lit basilica, as believers quietly share a meal that echoes both earthly sustenance and heavenly promise. The Christian approach to festivals also fostered charity, with special attention paid to feeding the poor during holy days, reinforcing the earlier themes of social justice and inclusion. So as your eyes grow heavier, picture these early Christian gatherings, not as wild parties, but as sacred communal moments, where food nourished body and spirit in equal measure. Christianity's transformation of festival food rituals wasn't just about changing menus, it was about reimagining how communities celebrated. I remembered and connected through the universal language of food. The gentle night continues to envelop you as you journey deeper into the subtle yet profound ways Christianity reshaped Roman culinary habits. Now turning to the symbolic and theological meanings infused into everyday foods, beyond feasts and fasts. You've seen bread and wine take center stage in Christian ritual. But the sacred symbolism didn't stop there. Food became a metaphor for spiritual truths, teaching believers about nourishment, sacrifice, and communion with God. Take bread, for example, not just a staple, but the bread of life, a symbol of Jesus himself. Breaking bread together wasn't only practical, it was a sacred act linking the physical and divine. This imbued ordinary loaves with extraordinary meaning. Fish, too, carried symbolism beyond its practical role as fasting-friendly food. The Greek word for fish, ichthys, became a secret sign among Christians, an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Eating fish quietly reinforced identity and faith under the watchful eyes of the Roman authorities. Honey, grapes, olives, these foods echoed biblical images of abundance and blessing, used in sermons and teachings to connect spiritual lessons with daily life. There's a quirky historical note. Some early Christian writers used the imagery of mustard seeds and leaven yeast to illustrate faith's power to grow quietly, but transform lives profoundly. Suddenly, everyday kitchen ingredients became profound theological metaphors. Historians still debate the extent to which these symbols influenced common eating habits, or remained confined to liturgical settings. Yet, there's no doubt that food was a bridge between the material and the spiritual realms. Even simple acts like blessing a meal elevated eating from mundane necessity to a sacred encounter. Christian households embraced this practice, weaving faith into the fabric of daily life. As sleep's gentle pull deepens, picture a humble table where hands break bread with reverence, eyes meet with quiet understanding, and the shared meal becomes a moment of divine connection. Christianity's culinary symbolism transformed food into a language of faith, teaching, and identity, making every bite a whisper of spiritual truth. The night flows on, and you find yourself drifting through the quieter corners of late Roman life, where Christianity's influence on food intersected with medicine, health, and dietetics. This blend of faith and science shaped not just what people ate, but why they ate it, embedding spiritual ideas into ideas about bodily well-being. Ancient Roman medicine, influenced by Hippocratic traditions, saw diet as a key to health. Foods were categorized by qualities like hot, cold, wet, and dry, believed to affect the body's humors. Christians inherited these ideas but also added spiritual dimensions. Fasting wasn't only about obedience, it was thought to purify the body and soul, strengthening both against illness and sin. Abstaining from rich foods was medicine for the spirit as much as for the flesh. Monastic communities, in particular, became centers of medical knowledge, cultivating medicinal herbs and preparing remedies alongside food. This overlap reinforced the idea that food was medicine, a gift from God to heal and sustain. You might find it amusing that some early Christian doctors recommended eating moderate amounts of garlic and onions for health, despite their social stigma in dining etiquette. It's like they were balancing between culinary diplomacy and medical pragmatism. Historians still debate whether Christian dietary practices significantly changed medical theory or simply reinterpreted existing ideas through a religious lens. The lines often blurred between diet, piety, and health, The Christian emphasis on temperance dovetailed neatly with medical advice to avoid excess and maintain balance. This harmony between spiritual and physical health shaped advice on everything from meal timing to food choices. Imagine a late Roman family. Not just saying grace, but following a diet plan informed by faith and ancient medicine. Seeking health in both body and soul. As you sink deeper into this restful night, picture the quiet gardens of monasteries, where monks tend healing plants and prepare herbal teas, embodying a holistic view of food as sustenance, medicine, and spiritual practice. Christianity's melding of food and health created a legacy where eating well meant caring for the whole person body, mind, and spirit. The soft darkness envelops you further as you continue exploring how Christianity's dietary influence extended into the political and social arenas of the late Roman Empire. Food wasn't just a private matter, it became a subtle tool of power, identity, and control. Imperial authorities began to see Christian fasting and food customs as markers of loyalty or defiance. Emperors and officials observed how Christians' refusal to partake in pagan feasts or sacrifices challenged traditional Roman religious unity. This created tension at public banquets and state ceremonies, where food was both a political statement and religious rite. Christians refusing certain dishes were making quiet but powerful declarations about their allegiance. Interestingly, some emperors adopted Christian dietary norms as part of official policy, promoting fasting and temperance to align imperial image with the growing Christian majority. The Emperor Constantine, for example, reportedly encouraged fasting during Lent. Historians still argue how much these imperial policies shaped popular practice versus reflecting already widespread Christian customs. The relationship between church and state remained complex and evolving. Socially, Christian food customs reinforced community boundaries, marking insiders and outsiders. Sharing food within Christian circles was an act of solidarity, while exclusion from pagan dining rituals could lead to social isolation. There's a quirky incident recorded where a Roman official lamented that Christians' refusal to drink from certain cups disrupted traditional hospitality, customs a small but telling sign of food's political charge. Food thus became a site of negotiation between power, faith, and identity, where every bite and sip could carry meaning beyond mere sustenance. As your eyelids grow heavier, picture the grand halls of Rome, where political power and religious identity clash quietly over what served at the table, shaping the empire's future as much as battles or decrees. Christian dietary practices didn't just nourish bodies, they fed the complex interplay of faith, politics, and social belonging in a changing world. The quiet night deepens, and you drift into the fascinating world of Christian monasticism, where food and faith intertwined in unique and disciplined ways. Monasteries became laboratories of culinary innovation, spiritual devotion, and community care. Monks lived under strict rules, often set by figures like Saint Benedict, dictating when, what, and how to eat. Fasting was rigorous but balanced with sustenance needed for hard work and prayer. Meals were simple but nourishing grains, vegetables, and occasionally fish or cheese. Monasteries cultivated gardens, orchards, and apiaries, growing their own food with care and intent. This self-sufficiency linked manual labor, prayer, and the cycles of nature, creating a holistic rhythm to monastic life. Interestingly, monasteries pioneered food preservation techniques, drying fruits, salting fish that would influence broader culinary practices. They became centers for recipe collection and transmission, blending local traditions with Christian dietary principles. Historians still debate how widespread monastic dietary innovations were, and how much they influenced laypeople's eating habits. Some argue monasteries were isolated sanctuaries. Others see them as seeds of culinary change spreading across regions. Charitable feeding of the poor was central to monastic mission. Alms kitchens provided daily meals to the needy, embodying Christian charity and social justice. Food was a means of grace and survival. Picture a monastery at dawn, monks silently breaking bread before heading to the fields. Their meals humble, but filled with purpose and faith. This was food as prayer in motion, work sanctified by nourishment. Christian monasticism left a lasting mark on medieval and modern culinary traditions, proving that even in austerity, food could be a source of community, innovation, and sacred rhythm. As sleep beckons, imagine these quiet halls and gardens where food and faith dance in gentle harmony, nurturing souls as well as bodies. The night slowly winds down as you immerse yourself in how Christianity influenced the preservation and transmission of food knowledge during the late Roman period, a legacy that shaped medieval and modern cuisine. Monasteries and Christian scholars copied, adapted, and preserved ancient texts on agriculture, cooking, and medicine, ensuring that knowledge survived tumultuous times. This included recipe collections, farming manuals, and dietary advice, often infused with Christian ethical perspectives. Imagine a monk painstakingly transcribing a manuscript by candlelight, blending classical Roman knowledge with Christian teachings on temperance and charity. These texts became cornerstones for future generations. Christian dietary laws and fasting rules were often embedded in these manuscripts, guiding cooks and farmers alike. The emphasis on seasonal eating and local ingredients reflected a growing ecological awareness tied to stewardship of God's creation. There's an amusing anecdote about a scribe who added a humorous note about the difficulty of growing certain exotic spices in colder climates, reminding us that even then, cooks had to improvise with what nature provided. Historians debate the extent to which these Christian preserved texts influenced secular culinary traditions, but their role in maintaining continuity and adaptation is clear. Through these writings, Christianity acted as a cultural bridge, safeguarding culinary wisdom while adapting it to new spiritual and social realities. As your eyes grow heavier, picture these fragile manuscripts resting in cool monastery libraries, silent witnesses to a world where faith and food knowledge were lovingly intertwined. This legacy helped shape not just what people ate, but how they understood food's role in health, community, and the divine. The night's embrace deepens as you follow Christianity's culinary footprints beyond Rome's borders, tracing how faith reshaped food cultures across the vast empire and into neighboring regions. Christianity spread along trade routes and through conquests, carrying its food customs and fasting traditions to diverse peoples. Local cuisines absorbed these influences, blending new religious dietary practices with indigenous ingredients and cooking methods. Picture fish becoming a fasting staple, not just in Rome but in far-flung provinces where seafood was scarce, prompting creative substitutions and adaptations. Lent observances introduced pulses and vegetables into diets that had previously favored meat-heavy fare. Christian charity rituals involving food also spread, inspiring new forms of communal meals and almsgiving across different cultures. Food became a universal language of faith, transcending ethnic and linguistic boundaries. There's an intriguing note that in some regions, Christian fasting aligned with pre-existing local abstinence traditions, easing the transition and fostering syncretism. This blending enriched both religious practice and culinary variety. Historians still debate how much Christianity directly transformed local foodways versus how local customs influenced Christian dietary observances. Yet the evidence is clear. Christianity acted as a catalyst for culinary exchange, shaping food traditions that evolved uniquely across the Mediterranean and beyond. As you drift towards sleep, imagine a bustling port where traders, pilgrims, and locals share meals shaped by centuries of religious influence and cultural exchange. This mingling of food and faith helped knit together a diverse empire, using the simple act of eating to build connections across continents and cultures. The night finally settles into its deepest quiet as you contemplate the lasting legacy of Christianity on Roman culinary culture, how ancient rituals, fasting, symbolism, and charity wove together to shape the future of Western food traditions. By the time the Roman Empire transformed into medieval Christendom, Christian dietary practices had redefined food's role in daily life, spirituality, and society. The rhythm of fasting and feasting marked the calendar, shaping seasons and celebrations for centuries to come. Monastic gardens, communal meals, and preserved recipes became the foundation of medieval cuisine. The values of temperance, charity, and sacred symbolism endured, influencing how people related to food as both physical and spiritual sustenance. You've traveled through humble homes, bustling markets, grand festivals, and quiet monasteries, witnessing how Christianity softened the harsh edges of Roman excess and gave food new meaning as a vehicle for grace, community, and identity. Historians still debate nuances and timelines, but the broad strokes are clear. Christianity didn't just survive the fall of Rome, it reshaped culture from the kitchen table up. Picture a flickering candle, casting gentle shadows on an ancient manuscript, the scent of herbs drying nearby, and the quiet murmur of prayer blending with the crackle of a hearth fire. As your breath slows and the night deepens, remember that the simple acts of breaking bread and sharing meals carry echoes of these ancient stories, threads connecting past and present, flesh and spirit. Now, let yourself drift into sleep, comforted by the knowledge that every meal is a quiet legacy of faith, history, and humanity's endless search for meaning. As the night gently fades, so does the pace of our journey. The bustling sounds of ancient kitchens and lively markets soften into distant murmurs. Imagine yourself resting in a quiet room, the warm glow of a fading candle flickering softly. Food, once a battleground of faith and culture, becomes a tender thread weaving together generations. The clatter of dishes and murmured prayers fade into the calm rhythm of breath and heartbeat. You're wrapped in the shared human story of nourishment, body and soul entwined. The complexities of history settle like dust, leaving only warmth, connection, and peace. Let your thoughts slow, your mind drift, and your heart rest. The legacy of these ancient meals is now part of your own story, a quiet, enduring comfort. Sleep well, wrapped in the gentle embrace of history's quiet feast.